five-eras theory is one of the theories that I use to try to formulate and visualize how the lands could have looked in the past. We have no idea what the actual history is. Yes, we're given a historical account, but we have many inconsistencies in it and we see many contradictions. The portion of the five-eras theory that I bring up here, though, is dividing it up into looking at how our civilization came to where it is. We start with the Golden Age. And the Golden Age consists of the first three eras. Now, there are many cultures that have a division of 5 eras that are across the land, and this is the reason why I picked 5 eras. I don't know. There could be many more, there could be many less. Many things were possible in the Golden Age. Human beings were much more advanced and much more developed spiritually, and they could achieve great architectural achievements. I also believe that in the third era is where the Star Fort builders came from. We're now in our contemporary age, or what others might call the Iron Age, or we jokingly refer to as the Plastic Age. And we call it that because everything is very disposable. And it seems as though we can feel internally that this era that we live in now does not match what was in the past. Although we'll be ridiculed for this, even though there's a lot of evidence that suggests otherwise. Today we're going to be looking at the Tartarian Age, or the 4th era. Now, I call this the Tartarian Age, and there are many alternative researchers that are saying we shouldn't be using this term all the time. It's just a name that's associated with it, a worldwide civilization that existed before our own. But what did it really look like? Well, we have to go back and revisualize the other eras. The first era, the Golden Age, where pretty much anything was possible, where human beings lived exceptionally long lifetimes, and they had an infinite spiritual health. They understood themselves, they understood their environment, and they existed in a wonderful balance with it. Not the promises of balances, but true balances. And their architectural achievements were stunning. They could build buildings that reached to the very clouds, and who knows, perhaps the very nature of the land is very different than we can imagine. It's not just buildings, it could have been vast flora and fauna that existed. And there's a reason why they try to tie this in with explanations of things existing many millions of years ago. But who knows what the actual timeline is? Was this first era of the Golden Age 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago? We don't really have any way to know. And the only remnants we see of this are in great rocks and in certain areas of the land where we have hints of once great buildings that existed in the very distant past. Or maybe it wasn't such a distant past after all, because the forces that destroyed these buildings and leveled the land are things that we cannot understand. But we can certainly speculate on them. The whole point behind the first era of the Golden Age is to understand that in the very beginning, we believe that human beings were exceptionally developed. Now, this theory could be completely wrong, but the evidence that backs it up is whenever you go across the land and you find evidence of melted buildings, vast structures that once covered the land. And on this channel, we explored the Castle Rock ruins in Wisconsin, and we saw that there were hints of vast structures that once existed there that had to be larger than we could possibly imagine. We also see structures such as Devil's Tower. It may have once been a large tree, or it may have once been a large structure, or something else. In the second era, we postulate a civilization that existed, rising from the ashes of the first era. Now, others may call this the Silver Age, and we'll review what this really was when we look at the Greek theory of the 5 ages. However, the second era, this is where we suspect the pyramid builders really came from. And we think of the original pyramids, or the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. They were simply smaller satellite pyramids. We have evidence of much larger pyramids that are built across the land. And in my theories on this channel, I believe that this came from a second era, or a civilization that was still in a golden age, but in a different portion of a golden age. They constructed pyramids because it was a geometrically sound structure, and it also showed their connection to the land. And we don't fully understand what kind of technology that was available both in the construction of these pyramids, and then how they factored into the overall society and the use of such technology. But we suspect that these buildings also developed the internal human being. They supported the spiritual health of the person, and not just provided a structure for societal use. It's a very interesting balance to think of. A building that serves society, but at the same time serves the individual. It seems as though our modern buildings oftentimes deprive us of our spiritual health, and they're very, how shall we say, not even remotely aesthetically pleasing. They're just there to be there and serve a function. The third era, which is another era in the last era of the Golden Age, that followed the pyramid builders. And this was an era where we believed that the civilization advanced to building the great star forts, where they could manipulate the land and the structures and integrate them accordingly. No one really knows what heights this civilization reached, but we can speculate that they had tremendous capabilities to build towers to the very sky. They also had the ability to form and shape the land in geometrical configurations that endure to this day. We can see the remnants of this civilization everywhere we look across the lands. There are star forts everywhere. There are also star forts that are integrated in the very land. We also have the theories about how the land is shaped in many places, where we see large sandbars that extend for many miles on the coasts in many lands across the realm. Now we look at our current era, the fifth era, the plastic age, and we see that none of what it is really compares to what we had in the past. We have tall towers of glass and steel, yet they give the impression of being very cheap and disposable. They also show us the fact that our civilization just seems to be something that's readily thrown away and can be thrown away. We also have to remember that we have many, many images of destruction from films, television shows. But today we're going to look specifically at the fourth era, the Tartarian civilization, or the civilization that preceded ours. We want to get an idea of what heights they reached. What was the maximum extent of their capabilities? Because this is the civilization that we see the most defined and detailed remnants of, such as the Iowa State Capitol, the many other beautiful state capitol buildings, the Art Deco buildings, all these buildings that we look at and all these city explorations that we do, they reflect the remnants of the fourth era. Now, let's look at the Tartarian fourth era civilization. And remember, Tartaria is just a term that I assigned to it. The civilization could have been called something completely different. Here's a possible timeline. Break it down into 3 eras, if you will, or 3 portions, 3 phases. An inception and a rising phase, an ascendancy in the height of their civilization, and then a decline and a fall. How long were each of these phases of this Tartarian civilization? We just don't know. They could be 1,000 years. They could be 100 years. We seem to have a great obsession with 1,000 years, and it's probably because it's a nice round number. What did this really look like, though? The main component of this theory is we have to consider the society that existed in this worldwide civilization, their culture, their values, their capabilities, and then ultimately their vulnerabilities. How was it they fell? When they rose, it was clear that they had remnants of the previous era, the third era. But we suspect that the third era endured a great reset or some sort of cataclysm. Looking at what this civilization looked like during its height, we have to think on the integration potentially of pyramid buildings, great towers and domes that reach to the very sky. They had energy capabilities and the ability to generate imagery or energy, both from the atmosphere, and then we've also speculated that they had some sort of crystal power source. They may have had many other sources of energy that they were able to draw from, because it's energy that allowed them to build a great society and civilization. Yet at the same time, we speculate that they had a balance that they achieved between the society and the individual. Harvesting this energy may have well reflected that balance in the fact that they were able to understand the energy that they could harvest from both the land and the very air and the atmosphere, and at the same time the energy that existed beneath the land. It seems as though this gave them the capability, along with their developed cultural and societal understanding, to achieve great constructions beyond our wildest dreams. We only see the bare bones remnants of many of these wonderful structures. Think on the fact that we have diagrams and sketches that show us these incredible buildings at their very height. Yet we take this to even what many would consider a science fiction imaging or imagery of what the society may have looked like at their very height. They had airships, they had vast tall buildings across the land. They had cities that stretched for many, many miles, much larger than the cities that we see today. And their structures were built to be enduring, to last. And of course you'll ask, well, exactly how did such a large signature of such a civilization fall? Why is it not with us? We don't understand the capabilities that were used to destroy it. We suspect that there was some sort of force or threat that arose in the land that either defeated the civilization internally or externally. A lot of the hints that we have, though, indicate that it was defeated internally. Initially in the conflict, the civilization won in an external conflict. Now, what do we mean by an internal conflict? This adversary found some sort of way to infiltrate the very beings of people and turn them against the civilization. We look at the great beauty at the very height, imagining a civilization that was in total balance. And it's not just the balance between society and the individual, it's also the understanding of the many cultural groups that no doubt existed in this civilization. They were able to exist in a harmonious nature. And we might reflect on the fact that it seems as though everything in our current civilization operates to turn us against each other through any visual difference or any sort of difference, be it a perceived economic, political, or whatever, to keep us at each other's throats. We look at some of the other possibilities of the previous civilization. Great airships with no limits in their traveling capacity. Great airships that could travel the land very quickly and efficiently. There's been a lot of speculation about airplanes recently, and perhaps the reality behind airplanes and jets is that they use some remnant of this technology, and that's why they appear to take off and land so slowly, almost as though they're hovering in a way and they don't operate in the manner that we're told. Yet we look at these great images of these airships and their vast hangars, and again we still see the remnants of this technology scattered across the land. This is what will be shown airship hangars looked like in the 1920s. The fact being, though, is that this did really exist. It causes us to question if the capacity behind this, though, is far greater than we're shown. That this is merely the bare bones remnants of it, the only portions of the technology that they could return to operational capacity. It's interesting to me that we even have accounts that question the existence and the veracity of these airships docking with tall buildings and tall structures. Some cities, such as Tulsa, even completely deny the account that an airship ever docked with any tall structure in the city. Yet there are other accounts within the history of aviation that shows that this is very true, and this was far more commonplace than they'd like us to think now. We consider the fact that there's been a very defined attack on airships. Now we visualize the decline of this previous civilization. If we suspect that they won a physical external war against some unknown enemy, we have to realize that the unknown enemy changed its tactics and infiltrated the civilization itself by corrupting human beings from the inside. As a result, they began to corrupt the very facets that kept the civilization propped up. Considering the fact that the civilization was based on an effective government that actually worked in the interests of the people. That was probably one of the first things that changed. The government then became self-serving, or serving the purposes and intentions of the exterior force that infiltrated it. Therefore, they began to turn the civilization against one another, emphasizing every single physical, social, and economic difference, whether they were real or not. Even the perceived differences, the ideals, caused these people to begin to distrust one another, and gradually their civilization began to erode from the inside out. The great buildings were no longer maintained, the energy systems were neglected. People began to even question their once great purpose in life, and achieving the very pinnacle of human being. They began to turn away from that. And you can find evidence in that in every single account from every civilization and culture that exists on the land today, that people were corrupted. Eventually, it became a point to where this civilization could no longer defend itself from an external threat, and either using some natural cataclysm, or perhaps an unnatural cataclysm, an artificial attack using weapons beyond our greatest imagination, they were able to destroy and wreck many of the greatest structures of the civilization that preceded ours. And we have numerous stories of destruction of great edifices in the past, wondrous cities that were reduced to nothing, melted to ash and rubble, and we really don't see any remnants of it today. We've explored many aspects of Tartaria on this channel before. We've also done theory videos where we've looked at what Tartaria looked like prior to the last reset. This channel calls Tartaria as our fourth era, or the civilization that preceded our current civilization. We believe it reached great heights. Heights that we can't even begin to imagine, with incredible airships and spectacular architecture and technology. And yet we can still see that Tartaria fell. What was the reason it fell? What were some of the challenges that it faced? We've posited a potential timeline for Tartaria, and we believe that there was a great conflict that occurred during its second phase of its civilization, or the ascendancy period, when Tartaria reached the very height of its civilization. What was really the nature of this conflict, and what gave us an indication that there was a great conflict that occurred? And how do we know that Tartaria prevailed in this conflict? This is a theory video, but I think it's an important theory video because we do have many signs around the lands in our remaining architectures, and we'll be examining our great monuments and the symbolism behind those monuments that indicate to us that there was a great conflict that occurred during the ascendancy phase of Tartaria. We still see the remnants everywhere we look of the architecture of this civilization that preceded ours. We'll be assured by our mainstream that this wondrous architecture was merely the results of hard work and the earlier phase of our own civilization. And yet there are so many signs in it that we just don't fully recognize. There are so many things that just don't seem to make sense or match what we're told their origin tends to be. For example, the great fortresses all across the lands that we're told were built during medieval times or even earlier, yet by people who didn't possess the wonders and the benefits of the so-called Industrial Revolution, people who lacked logistical capacity, and yet there seemed to be no limits behind what they could achieve if they simply focused their minds on it. At the same time, we're also going to consider the fact that many of these structures are without a doubt the remnants of the Tartarian civilization that preceded ours. The signs are in their architectural capacity, their remote location, and the fact that many of these structures simply cannot be explained, not even by our current methods, in the modern era after the Industrial Revolution. These are structures that were completed by a civilization that not only possessed a wondrous technological know-how, building capacity, and architecture that we can only begin to imagine, but they also had an incredible civilization and a society. In today's video, we're going to be exploring one of the greatest challenges that society faced, and the unified civilization of humanity in the past era managed to overcome. We're also going to speculate in terms of who the adversary was that they actually faced. And while we've explored that on the channel before, today's exploration is going to look a little deeper and try to posit some more theories on that aspect as we look at the great conflict and Tartaria's triumph. This is the monument to the Battle of the Nations. We're told it was built in Leipzig, Germany from 1898 to 1913. It's to commemorate the great victory over Napoleon, who we explored earlier this week. The attention we have towards this monument, though, is if we examine it in close detail, we see that there are many aspects of it that defy the explanation that this is truly a monument that is built to commemorate the Napoleonic conflict, or the Battle of the Nations that occurred towards the end of it. We see that there are many fine details with the figures on this monument that don't seem to match what we would expect soldiers to be wearing during the Napoleonic conflict. Indeed, we see figures wearing suits of armor, carrying swords, in direct contravention to what we're told the primary weapon being used during the Napoleonic conflict was. Now, of course, we'll be told that this is merely an idyllic representation, that this is to inspire us in the monument, to show us true commemoration of the soldiers that served during the Napoleonic conflict. Yet we have armored knights and we have what appear to be lions. We do have some construction photos of this monument to the Battle of the Nations. Yet at the same time, we have the usual challenges that we do when we examine these construction photos. Does scaffolding really prove construction? Does a big hole in the ground in some non-discrete location really show construction? There's also an odd issuing with scaling. This monument is nearly 300 feet high, and the stones and the masonry used in it appear to be far older than what we're told. We see figures that do not match anything from the Napoleonic Wars, and we see a structure that seems to commemorate something else. Is this supposed to be some sort of monument that was built during the medieval period? Because these figures that we see depicted on this monument look as though they would reflect some great medieval battle. Perhaps the Duke of Austria or the King of the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, I know it was an emperor, but I'm just merely making fun at all the inconsistencies within the monument. It's a very impressive monument, and you see that the construction behind it is truly extraordinary. Not something we'd expect to have happen from 1898 to 1913, completed just in time before the First World War, a monument to potentially an earlier world war. Or was this really a monument to any world war that our civilization knows of? What if this was truly a monument that was actually established by the civilization that preceded ours, the Tartarian civilization? Now I know to new viewers of the channel what I'm suggesting might be absurd and it might be offensive. But when we have observations of many of the figures that we see in this monument that just don't seem to make any kind of sense, what exactly is this figure here supposed to be representing from the Napoleonic conflict? This is not anything we have any account of, and even looking inside the monument, aside from truly impressive architecture, we see figures and representations that make absolutely no sense. They do not represent directly what we visualize as the soldiers that took part in the Napoleonic conflict. Where's the very well-dressed Duke of Wellington? Where's Admiral Nelson? Where's Prussian Field Marshal Blücher? This doesn't look anything like Field Marshal Blücher, or Wellington, or anyone else who participated in the Napoleonic conflict. So ask yourselves, what's really being depicted here? Is this just supposed to be some ideal representation of what transpired in the Napoleonic conflict? Or are these figures representing something completely different? Are they representing another civilization celebrating a great victory and triumph? When you examine these figures closely, and you consider what they may be representing, the symbolism behind them, you realize that there is a very strong possibility that they are depicting something from that Tartarian civilization that preceded ours. A civilization that valued life, that valued a unified societal effort and a great struggle that they faced. Who exactly was the adversary, though? And why do we believe that this monument to the Battle of the Nations really reflects them? Well, when it comes down to it, you analyze all these figures, and it's very difficult to find any sort of symbolism that matches that particular time frame. Now, of course, the official explanation will tell us that these figures merely represented the ideal times of German artwork from the late 19th and early 20th century, and it makes perfect sense. And of course, since people worked harder and there was no other needs going on in the German Empire at that time prior to World War I, or their great effort towards colonialism, that they could afford to build a monument like this, and do it quite easily. And these figures are merely representations of all the soldiers that served in the Napoleonic conflict. You don't need to build an exact representation, much like in the U.S. Civil War monuments, of which there are so many. Ubiquitous Civil War monuments that you can find in every courthouse in the United States. They always seem to be a column, and they always seem to have some sort of figure that is attached to the top. It's rather odd, though, because it seems as though that the Civil War monuments feel as though the actual base was already established, and then there were add-ons or modifications. Now, in some monuments, this shows a little bit more than others. These monuments are always called the Soldiers and Sailors monuments, and you can find them across the land. The most prominent one that we looked at in previous explorations on this channel being the Soldiers and Sailors monument in Indianapolis, Indiana. A very impressive and tall column adorned with numerous decorations. Now, to be fair and objective, some of the decorations towards the base do appear as Union soldiers. They do reflect what we'd expect to see from the nature of the Civil War. But the larger figures and the base stones don't seem to reflect that. And the figure on top of this very impressive monument most certainly does not seem to reflect anything from the Civil War. And we look at its very questionable construction and the so-called documentation of it, and there seems to be so many difficulties in simply explaining it. We also have accounts of other Civil War monuments that, due to the, how shall we say, changing perceptions of the time, have been modified by having the statues removed from them, as we can see in this impressive column of what used to be a Confederate monument. Yet if you just pull off the statue, what do you have? You still have the baseline column. Was there something else that was once on top of this column? Notice that they're also using a high-powered modern crane. There are many Civil War monuments across our favorite state to explore, Iowa. And the reason we say Iowa is our favorite state to explore is because that's where all the exploration started. And naturally, they have a very impressive Soldiers and Sailors monument out in front of the Iowa State Capitol as well, almost looking like you're in Rome. The Soldiers and Sailors monument in Iowa we've looked at in a very early exploration on the channel. Now, this is certainly one that is very difficult to explain because we have this statue of Iowa. This was made in the 1890s. How exactly, given what we know of the society in the 1890s, would this have been appropriate or tolerated at that time? At that time, we're told that it was very inappropriate for a lady to show even her ankle, and yet here we have full frontal nudity being depicted. Other aspects of this monument don't really make a lot of sense, such as this figure we have that looks like Julius Caesar on the back. Now, we do have Civil War soldiers and some strange portraits that are put on it, but I'm not beginning to question if this monument was modified, that they had the statues that didn't make any sense and then changed them. And this other monument that's supposedly to a leading political figure in Iowa earlier in its history, and how exactly do any of the figures on this part of the monument make sense? There's also the Sergeant Floyd Monument, yet another obelisk that's located in Council Bluffs, Iowa. This is supposed to be dedicated to a fallen member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So let me get this straight. A non-commissioned officer in the United States who died in the early 19th century has a very large obelisk dedicated to them as a monument and a memorial. Is that really what this is all about? Now, I know there's many different theories behind what obelisks could really represent and the power structure that they may represent. But for this exploration, let's just look at the fact and consider that the obelisk really is a monument. Here we actually have a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officer with facial hair, obviously before World War I. And yet we're told that the credit for this monument, that it was done in the early 1900s to commemorate Sergeant Floyd, who had fallen during the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, granted, it's not an impressive obelisk that's the height of the Washington Monument that we looked at, but it's still impressive nonetheless. We also have other monuments that seem to indicate some sort of victory, and on many of the triumphal arches you see figures like this. But why are we always representing Rome? Well, if we look at our 5 eras theory that we go off of on the channel as the baseline of our explorations, we can see that the Tartarian era is the era that preceded ours, or the civilization that preceded ours. They had their own period of rise and ascendancy, and then eventually their fall. We also looked at the Reset War, which occurred after that civilization that preceded ours fell, and the Reset War was a conflict that was designed to destroy the remaining enclaves of the previous civilization. When we look at the Tartaria or 4th era civilization's timeline, we see that it had 3 distinct phases: a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline. That decline came with a large battle that they had lost, or a significant conflict. We believe that that conflict was against the same adversary that they had faced earlier in their civilization and had defeated. In this exploration, we're looking and positing that all these monuments were in recognition of this adversary they defeated. And who was this adversary? Well, we've looked at it before when we did the exploration on ancient evil. We have serpents that are represented in many of these monuments. We have serpents that are represented as a force of evil. And we certainly have the subculture of snakes or serpents representing evil. Now, do I want to be against snakes and say that you need to kill a snake if you come across it? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. We're merely considering the symbolism here. But we have symbolism from many different aspects that show that for whatever reason, the serpent represented the adversary that the previous civilization faced. Also, think on the nature that we're told of the serpent. The ability to deceive, the ability to change people from the inside and corrupt them. That seems to be what the serpent represented. So whoever this adversary was that Tartaria faced, they certainly had all kinds of unique abilities to change people from the inside out, and perhaps they even had the ability to change the shapes of their own physical forms. We just don't know. We still see aspects of the serpent that endure to this day in various belief systems across the land. We also look at how the representation of the serpent factors into many of our fantasy stories that we're told have no basis in fact and absolutely have no historical foundation. Yet we can't ignore the fact that the aspect of the serpent is constantly depicted and used in many different stories, from Conan the Barbarian to the revived He-Man series, which interestingly enough was quickly canceled once they decided to depict a race of serpents that they fought, and even Snake Mountain becoming a giant serpent god. Now that could all just be a coincidence, but I find it very fascinating that a popular cartoon that was used for marketing was suddenly no longer popular and pulled off the air very quickly. Again, it could just be a coincidence. There are depictions of serpents and what they represent in all cultures from all times, from our contemporary era. We view the serpent with a sense of trepidation. And of course, there are many people who seem to have a natural, almost instinctive fear of serpents or snakes. Yet not all the time is the depiction or use of serpents negative. In the alternative, there seems to be a very positive depiction of serpents that can be seen with different societies, that they represented power and the ability to achieve power. However, looking at most of the representations, they seem to show a very powerful and capable adversary that had to be overcome. We look here at these reliefs in Riga and Latvia, and we see some very serpent-like qualities in this dragon creature. And indeed, dragons were also referred to as serpents or great worms. Many of these figures here in the same city showing what appears to be some sort of serpent adornment. Is it possible that these were compromised human beings from the previous civilization? Were they changed in some sort of fundamental way, and this created a different segment within the previous Tartarian civilization that fought against it? Perhaps this was the enemy that they had to fight and overcome, and this was the great victory that they won. Until, as we suspect, the adversary changed their tactics and tended to be much more successful as they did so. It's hard to say, but at the same time, you can find this symbolism all over the land, from many different cultures, or at least so we're told. But do we really see these as different cultures? Or are all these symbols, or all these pictures, all these reliefs, very, very similar in how they're depicted? And what are the odds that all these symbols, all these reliefs, and all these depictions would look exactly the same across timelines and across many different civilizations? Because you can see that in many different civilizations they represented the serpent as some sort of divine being. Of course, the question always comes down to, was this a positive or a negative depiction? And to be frank, you can see both. The reliefs in Riga also show something else, a power of a lion, the power of the sun. There are many different symbols, and we will be exploring Riga in due time. It's quite an interesting location. But for right now, we're just taking a look at what we see. And in the symbols, it's almost as though we see a little bit of a conflict being represented. A conflict of almost two segments of humanity, or perhaps an uncorrupted segment of humanity against a corrupted segment of humanity. It's really hard to say. Yet we see some of the familiar symbols that we've seen in other explorations that we've done. We always see the lion, and the lion's always in a position of power. We've also seen this helmet before, and this helmeted figure, and it's in the most unlikely of places on a building that we're told was Art Deco in New York State. And yet even more interesting figures that could perhaps depict something that was far more advanced. Is this a being? Is this just an artistic representation? What exactly is this relief truly of? There's no shortage that we have, though, of triumph figures, or figures that are depicted on arches of triumph. And usually you'll have the same consistent images or statues. We have a horse. We have what typically tends to be a woman wearing a wreath or a laurel around the head. Sometimes we even have angelic wings. What exactly is this supposed to represent? And why exactly do we see this symbol depicted so frequently everywhere that we look? We're always told that the laurel wreath was usually the Roman symbol of victory and oftentimes worn during the so-called Roman triumph. But did the Romans really exist as we think or believe them to have existed? And yet, looking in other forms of symbolism that we have across the land, we can still see the power that was depicted in both eagles and lions. And interestingly enough, we're told that the so-called Roman civilization venerated the eagle, the aquila as they called it, that their legions carried. But what if this was merely a subversion of what really happened? What if the previous civilization did use eagles and lions, in addition to the often seen griffin, to represent an animal of power, to represent their unified strength when they engage this terrifying adversary? We even have depictions such as Perseus decapitating Medusa and holding the head up high, and this was most certainly not an easy task. We have numerous depictions of lions and eagles fighting and defeating snakes, and in nearly every depiction that you see, it is the lion or the eagle that is victorious. That with the full power of the previous civilization, the adversary stood no chance against it. But we believe that the adversary changed their tactics and subverted the previous civilization, suddenly making the people believe that their great heroes were actually villains, and they began to decay and destroy themselves from the inside out. It might seem like it's not a plausible explanation, yet at the same time, we can see that in our current civilization, division and strife are the very things that seem to be constantly reinforced in every segment of our current society. But looking at all the depictions, we can see that there was a civilization, there was a time where they seemed to be far more unified in purpose. And it was through that unification in purpose that we see in all this symbolism that they were able to achieve a great victory over the adversary that they had faced in the Fourth Era. Other aspects that you consider when you look at many of these reliefs and many of what is represented in these statues is to realize that this was not an easy battle. Oftentimes we see that this was a life or death struggle, and perhaps this represented what the previous civilization truly faced. Now, it's true, these monuments, these statues, these paintings, all these depictions could simply be a coincidence that all these symbols represent different things from different cultures across different times. And once again, you have to ask the question, just how many coincidences are we actually looking at and accepting for the account that we have of history to be exactly accurate and correct? How difficult was this struggle the previous civilization faced? And if it really was the great triumph that we see, and we see many triumph arches all across the land, the arches of triumph, showing the wondrous architectural capabilities, while at the same time reflecting the achievements of that previous civilization. Now, could these remaining monuments have been altered over time with all the so-called renovations that we witness? That the symbols, at least some of the symbols that could be changed, were changed to potentially give us a different perception, or to try to reflect to us that there were many different civilizations that just happened to have a appreciation for one root previous civilization. I find that explanation very difficult to believe. I find it very difficult to believe in the fact that everybody wanted to emulate the great architectural achievements of Rome and Greece, and they kept doing it all the way to the end of the 1800s. How exactly does that make any sense? Or does it make more sense that all of these stunning monuments and architectural achievements that we see, all of these symbols, the reason there is so much recursion in them is because they were produced by that civilization that preceded ours? That these civilizations had their monuments, and they produced their monuments to reflect their great achievement of winning a very difficult conflict. A conflict that required their society to truly be unified. You have to ask yourself these questions. What truly makes sense? And if it doesn't make sense, how exactly do you explain it? You always ask the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why. And after you ask those 5 W's, then you have to ask how. And if it's not easy to answer those questions, and if you notice inconsistencies, then you have to ask more questions, and you have to keep exploring. Because the answer tends to elude us if we just accept whatever simple explanation that we're given, even if it makes no sense whatsoever. Such as this wonderful monument being constructed in 24 minutes, which someone may try to tell us. And do we believe it, or do we question it? It's ultimately up to us how far we want to go with these explorations, and if we're really seeking answers. It's not easy. it's certain to say that the path of least resistance is just to accept exactly what you've been told. To accept that there are legitimate reasons for all of these monuments looking the same, for all this architecture appearing the same, even though in some cases between the cultures that constructed them there's 1,000 years, and what we're told is half a world away of distance. So how exactly does that make any sense when you really consider it? I believe that these monuments that we're looking at, the reason that they're so similar is that they did come from the civilization that preceded ours. As a little bit of a bonus, I wanted to take a closer look at the Cathedral Basilica in St. Louis, Missouri. When we explored the basilica on the ground, I didn't really have the chance to stay inside and really look at all the symbolism that we had within the very impressive cathedral. We can see here at the altar we have what looks to be a smaller dome. Now remember the size and immensity of this building. I also wanted to take a close look at the mosaics or the paintings, because what do they really represent? We're told that this is a very impressive Catholic cathedral basilica in St. Louis. Are these figures supposed to be the wise men, the apostles? There's many unique paintings and drawings and figures that adorn the domes, the walls, the arches, all the impressive structural achievements of this unbelievable edifice. Here, looking up in the dome, we see what appears to be angelic figures. We also have what we would expect to be the representation of Jesus, and yet at the same time we see other figures on the inside of the dome and under the dome. What exactly is this supposed to represent? Some aspect of the Holy Spirit within the individual? The more you look, it seems as though you get more questions, because these are very interesting depictions. Is this something from Ben-Hur, even though this cathedral basilica was constructed well before that film came out? At least so we're told, although I suspect it was constructed very long before Ben-Hur ever came out. Looking here over at this particular dome, they seem to represent more modern aspects within this painting. Yet we see many structures that are depicted on the wall as well. Is that showing some sort of development? Or is that chronicling something that came in a civilization before us? Because you look and you see some of the structures that are depicted in the painting. And what exactly do these symbols represent? And I'm sure there'll be many who will tell me that these are simple Catholic representations and that they represent the ultimate form of piety in Catholicism. And that's fine, and I could accept that. But I have to look at these figures, I have to look at these depictions and really ask what exactly is being depicted. Is this really showing us what we're told? Well, here it may, and I do suspect that there are tenets of our major religions in our current civilization that do have their origin in our very distant past. So, could we have constructed parts of it, changed it, decorated it? Yes. But are there portions of it that have been there a very long time? Will pour out my spirit on all flesh. I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. What exactly is this representing? And what does it truly mean? Both the saying and the depiction. Now, I have some familiarity with Catholicism, but that just defies what I'm aware of. Maybe somebody out there. This week's topic is Tartaria's first conflict, and I wanted to take a little bit of time really going into this. I had debated whether or not to do this as a live stream or a standard exploration, but I thought it would work a little bit better as a live stream because it is a very interesting topic and there's a lot of depth in it. Although the first question might be, how exactly do we know that there was a first conflict even for the civilization that preceded ours, that on this channel we refer to as Tartaria? And one of the main pieces of evidence I'll highlight concerns the monument in Leipzig, Germany, and that is the monument to the Battle of the Nations. At least that's what it's officially called. And according to official history, this wondrous monument was constructed in the early 1900s, and it has some very interesting details. It's to commemorate the defeat of Napoleon in the Battle of Leipzig, and yet, oddly enough, you'll find that it has virtually no depictions or representations of any of the soldiers of that particular era. There's no line infantry, there's no British redcoats, there's no Prussian infantry, there's not even a depiction of Napoleon in defeat. Nothing. What you have are these very interesting and advanced looking knight characters. You have all other kinds of figures that almost look like they're from a science fiction film. I was speaking to someone earlier today that said that. And you even have the endless depictions of serpents. Now, I don't want to go off onto the whole serpent hate thing, but serpents are depicted and they're supposed to represent a threat or an evil. Not to say that we've got anything against snakes, although I certainly wouldn't want to encounter an anaconda or python again in jungle warfare school, but we don't need to go back to that. Another thing we see is we see a lot of representations of eagles and a lot of representations of lions. And it's not just on this particular monument. It's on monuments across the land. Many different nations and monuments that seem to have been given different purposes and may, just may, have been modified. And yes, they even tell us that these monuments have been modified because they've been restored, if you follow me. So that's our main evidence that there was a conflict. And what are your thoughts on that so far? And it's really good to see everybody, and good to see everybody coming in. But I think the monument at Leipzig is a good way to start and really show what we're actually looking at, that we do have evidence of this first conflict. Chassis. At least this one has clothes on. Yes, this is true. And oddly enough, you'll come across monuments where they don't have clothes on, which is very intriguing. So, in any event, we'll move on. And here's the top of this monument, and once again, we have these individuals who might look more at home if we're talking about a Middle Ages monument, or a monument to some great battle in the Middle Ages, and yet they seem to be wearing more advanced armor, and they actually seem to have lions' heads, bears' heads. I mean, you could see it anyway, but, you know, they're supposed to be lions' heads. But who knows for sure? It's another one of those little details that we question. Oh, and something I glossed over in the first image. What are your thoughts on this sword that this knight, at least what we might think of as a knight, or man-at-arms, or housecarl, or all the other different official terms we had for soldiers in the Middle Ages, which, remember, this was to commemorate the Napoleonic Wars. What does this represent, this Lightbringer sword? Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, but, I mean, does this really seem like a sword, or does it seem like something much more advanced? What are your thoughts? Oh, easy money, those are pit bull heads. Ah. Yes, I could see that. PMC, he's a Jedi. Yes, it's your wide-angle lightsaber. Maybe that's what they should have gone with in the sequels. It would have had a little bit more credibility, right? Instead of the handguards, right? In any event. Great question. Who carved those? I have absolutely no idea. I mean, yes, I could recite the official historical account to you, but the fact that they pulled this off in the early 1900s, right before World War I, is quite a feat in and of itself. But to tell you, who knows? Not sure. It's just very intriguing. And this is a drawing, a painting, a picture that's supposed to represent the commemoration of the Battle of the Nations, the defeat of Napoleon. So we decided not to put Napoleon at all on that monument. Oh well. Now, this is something else I want you to keep in mind as we go through and we actually look at this conflict. And I really want you to take this statement here and apply it to what we've had in our modern conflicts, basically World War I and onward. And this statement goes as follows. The primary purpose of arms in mortal conflict is to inflict as much physiological damage to the recipient in the most efficient and effective way possible in a short amount of time. All other considerations are secondary. Now, I want to ask you a question. How many times in modern conflict, so World War I and everything that's followed, has this really been abided by? Now, you can always make the argument that, well, perhaps, militaries were incompetent, politicians were incompetent, there was political meddling in military affairs, and that's why we've had so much difficulty achieving this, because even when we had World War I and World War II, you can find numerous examples on all sides where it didn't really seem like they were remotely trying to abide by this. Now, this was something that started to get me in trouble in the history department because I began to question this. The reason I bring this up is I want you to keep this in mind because we're really looking at a conflict, and I'm not going to call it a war. Wars are what we call things today. I'm going to call this a conflict because it really seemed like they were actually abiding by this. And you really have to think about what this would really be like. If there's really nothing holding anyone back, if you're really trying to physiologically or physically destroy the recipient or your adversary without holding anything back. That's really the unlimited conflict, because really I can find many examples of constraints in every conflict. Yes, even World War II. Now, how did this all start? How do we know that this conflict started? What were the rumors of this conflict? And what was the state? Ah, Robert, New Age wars are theater. Yes, quite a manner of speaking they seem to be, don't they? Ah, psychological warfare. Yes, that's become a very powerful component of it as well. Oh, thank you, Tracy. I try to do the best that I can. We'll see how far I can go with it. Ah, KC933. Now we have drones. Yes, drones, and more drones. Mentioned in the news quite a bit. And then Hector says, greed and power. Yes, and there's no doubt that definitely applied in the past. But what are we looking at with this conflict? Now, we're not exactly sure where this happened in the timeline of the previous civilization. I have a theory that it happened at some point during the middle timeline of the previous civilization that we just called Tartaria, although it was probably called something else, and who knows what kind of language they spoke or if they even used spoken languages. We don't even know that. But in any event, we theorized that they were opening portals. They were looking to explore different lands, and we have many different images and concepts of portals, and we have explored them independently before. Now, what's their reality and how do they function? We're not really sure. We don't know the practical reality behind it. But we have many different hints, and we have many allusions to the fact that there were portals, that there was always a desire to reach other lands. And not using the great rocket ships that we have now, or at least the great starships that we're building now, or Saturn V for that matter, but using another means to reach other lands, perhaps other realities, other planes of existence, or maybe it is still this physical plane, and there's just a different way they were trying to reach other lands. We don't know, but in the process of meddling with these portals, and this is what I'll use to highlight this evidence, why is it on all these cathedrals that we have, and great monasteries that kind of look like cathedrals, and they oftentimes are referred to as cathedrals, they consider the main doors or entryways portals. That's actually what they call them. And these are very elaborate. You have multiple arches, you have the columns. Is it just for artistic decoration? Is it just to show your piety? Or did it actually have a technological function? What are your thoughts on that? Why do we see it so often? Hector, outer space, the lands beyond the wall or ice wall. Good way to refer to it, no doubt about it. RB, they need some of us left over as slaves. Ah, yes, there does seem to be a need for human resources, doesn't there? That never seems to go away. Kathy, now we have 5D chess warfare. Dwayne, warfare today is an economic investment. The world banks invest on both sides. If one side is dominant, the conflict would be short. Both sides are evened out to extend the conflict. Ah, that does seem to be what happens. But who's really pulling the strings and why? Is it just simply to keep us distracted, occupied, or simply to more effectively facilitate control? Well, we'll get to that when we look at the second conflict, but those are great points all of you make. Ah, yes. RB, portals, as if you don't have enough. And that's what this seems to reflect, is this technological component that we have. And when you look at some of these great doorways, and I certainly don't want to discount the theory that these doorways could have been made for larger beings, because I'm open to all theories at all times, but another theory, which I think is a little bit more applicable, at least for this particular exploration, is that these doorways were to facilitate the transportation of large amounts of people, large amounts of materials, so you could travel to different areas if they indeed had that capability. And maybe there was something else that we don't understand for why these doorways were so large. And you also notice you have the very fine-tuned and concentric geometry that's built behind the already wonderfully built and elaborate decorative doorways that appear in many different places. And you can see it. You can even count how many arches or doorways that you have, and you could also find different means of counting in different ways. So is it some sort of power generator? Is it to really coalesce all the power that was being generated at that time as a nexus point? Or could it really open a doorway? Was it a way to travel between one physical point to another physical point? You know, just like that saying goes, the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line. It's to be there instantaneously. You walk through the door. Or perhaps it meant something else. It is intriguing, though, that all of these centers, or nexus points, if you will, ended up as churches now, or current religious buildings. I won't just say churches, but mosques, depending where you are in the land, and all their different uses, and yet they all had that spiritual component with them. And perhaps that's a residual of the energy, and it only made sense. Again, it's all a theory. But when you look closely at a lot of these doors, and here's looking directly up at this series of arches that you have, it really gives you an idea of how intricate it is. Are you to believe that it was really carved? Of course, we've been over it many, many times. Ah, Hector, healing centers, yes. And no doubt they serve that purpose as well. Chassis, after watching Stargate Atlantis, not all portals were good to go into. Absolutely. And you actually have many science fiction films that warn the danger about opening portals. And the theory is that by opening portals, you can access a darker land, or a land of chaos. And indeed, if you've ever seen the film, oh, this is a good one, Texas Redneck Hippie, let's make a deal for door 3. Yeah, no doubt about it. If you've ever seen the film Event Horizon, the very plot of that film is about opening a portal to a land of chaos. In fact, that's exactly what they say. Robin, the Slavic Vedas talk about shutting down the needles after the invaders came in, so they couldn't reach the higher lands. Absolutely. And it's actually referred to in many cultures. Many of the same ways refer to that, and that very thing happening. So, by meddling with these portals, and here you can see one of the more elaborate examples in terms of just how large these doors are, with a person there for scale, they managed to open a doorway to another land, but in the process of doing so, they probably opened a doorway to a land that they didn't want to access, or they enabled something that had once had access to our current lands access again. And another theory is that perhaps they had messed up the boundaries between realities by examining this technology and practicing it. Now here's an even more frightening thought. What if this technology is still active? What if there is something about the theory that this old technology, I'm not talking about anything that we've recently built. What my theory is that we're merely tampering with what's already been in existence. What if that's why we have these strange reality breakdowns? And you see how this connects back to the exploration we did earlier this week concerning the nature of reality. And there are many other explorers who look into the concept of reality breakdowns. What if it's because we actually weaken the boundaries between realities? And yes, I know there was a Star Trek The Next Generation episode with Worf, of all characters, and hey, I liked Worf, but it was called Parallels, where he actually found himself jumping from reality to reality within the episode. It was very interesting. Good high science fiction concept, Star Trek The Next Generation. 7th season, as I recall. But just think about that. What other explanation can you come up with for these elaborate doorways? What purpose were they really serving? It's so crazy. People just write this stuff off. Yeah, but they do. Oh, anybody could do this. You know, they just built this in the Middle Ages because they apparently had nothing better to do. You know, the Dark Ages really weren't that bad. That's exactly what they do. KC933 are keyholes portals too. They may well be. They may well be. Or they may be a means of accessing the portals, for all we know. And as Robert says, yes, the instructions have been lost. But somebody, or some interest, or some entity, however you want to think of it, is trying to access them again. They're trying to find the way to use them again. Clara, there are guards who watch over it. Not everyone can see the creatures. Ooh, that's very intriguing. And that actually segues nicely into our next talking point. And I just want to show you this image because you see the symbolism. And yes, symbolism is going to be something that we look at a lot in this exploration. I mean, look at how ornate and detailed this is. What's really the purpose behind this? And if somebody really could do this in the 14, 15, 1600s, as we're told. Now, granted, they also tell us that in many cases these cathedrals were constructed over hundreds of years, which is quite an interesting proposition to consider. You know, I mean, unless you're going to accept the fact that weather is just always very moderate in Europe all the time and doesn't change that much, or North America, or wherever in the northern latitudes, you have these incredible achievements. And they're oftentimes hard to describe. But it was in meddling with these portals that they actually enabled a chaotic entity, or what we might think of as some other sort of creatures, what we refer to on this channel as the ancient enemy. And this was the dimension of chaos that suddenly had access to our lands, our realm, or our plane of existence, whatever you want to think of it as. There's really no wrong way to think of it. And this was an insidious and malevolent entity that had no doubt come across humanity in the past, and perhaps had been responsible for destruction in the previous eras. Or perhaps not, we don't know for sure. But because of many of our origin stories alluding to this, this seems to be a consistent theme that we have of allowing this concept of the ancient enemy access, first to our lands and then ultimately to our individual being. Now, yes, there are religious components to this, and all the major religions tend to reflect this. But what exactly is this entity? We don't know for sure. How does it operate? That's something else we don't know for sure. But we do understand that it has a lot of influence in ways that we don't fully understand. And when it was granted access to the land in the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria, it expected an easy, direct victory over that civilization at that time. Easy money. Megamind looking. Yeah, I mean, different ways to represent it. You know, I've already used the representations from John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness, and I thought I would do something a little bit different this time. But, you know. Inferno, it was so intricate, I think, because it was so easy for them. We do things on a grand scale because it's easy. You're probably more right than you know on that one, too. You know, and it comes down to, were they meddling with things that they shouldn't have been? Most of these, this is Fairy Girl, most of these buildings have been built upon the entries to the underworld. The purpose must have to do with the entries below the buildings. That could be the physical component of it, no doubt. Rebecca, why is our species so curious? That's a good question. Is it just something that we actually have within our psyche? Is it part of our spiritual component? Are we ethereal beings and that's why we're curious? And while it may be a strength, it could also be a weakness. Is it something that needs to be tempered, balanced? I don't know, RB. But yeah, we're definitely curious. A lot of us are. But yes, it could just as well be a downfall. Ah, Jamie Griffin, the Forgotten. Very true. Or as H.P. Lovecraft called them, the old ones, or the great old ones. Maybe that's what he was referring to. Who knows for sure? Dwayne, we are curious because we need things to make sense. Ah, true. And you know something, Dwayne? You actually point to one of my greatest personal weaknesses. I do need things to make sense. And maybe that works against me sometimes. For example, slipping on rocks in places I probably shouldn't be walking. And so this really facilitated the return of the ancient enemy by examining these portals. Now, we have an account from Irish myth that tends to be overlooked for whatever reason, as Irish myth is neglected. I'm not exactly sure why. That referred to these creatures called the Fomorians. And I explored this when we explored the Tuatha De Danann, the very interesting deities that came back to Ireland from the legendary land of the north. Not going to get into that part, but concerning the Fomorians, they seem to act as these chaotic beings who had suddenly returned to our land, potentially from access through a portal. And so this is one representation or way to think of them as. And then you have all other kinds of terrifying creatures. Now, one of the reasons why I like to refer to Tolkien's work, J.R.R. Tolkien, is one of the creatures that he talked about, or the spiritual creatures, were the Maiar. I think I'm pronouncing it properly, but if you recall Gandalf the Wizard, he was actually a Maiar spirit. And then, of course, if you refer to the demonic or horrific Bolrogs or Balrogs, there's different ways to pronounce that as well, the demons of the ancient world, they were actually Maiars just like Gandalf was. So what kind of creatures would they form if they suddenly came into our land? Terrifying dragons, horrifying beasts, and things that we would think of as demons. Unstoppable physical entities, if you will. Or there could be another explanation for it. Perhaps they actually corrupted some of the existing technology and created their own creatures. Either one seems to be true, and yet there are examples of both. And then I remember when I first started my explorations and I was trying to place the Battle of Ventry, which is another Irish myth, which refers to Ireland defending itself from an invasion by the King of the World. And initially I had thought that was in the earlier era, perhaps the Third Era battle. But I'm pretty convinced that that had to have been a Fourth Era, because I'm under the theory that a lot of our records, any sort of details of the earlier eras was completely wiped out. Anything they had in the Fourth Era, it was just as much a legend to them as it is to us. And no doubt it would have been wiped out in the last reset. So because of the fact that we have details of the Battle of Ventry, this invasion of Ireland on Ventry Beach by the King of the World, I think that's actually referring to how bad things may have gotten in this first conflict. Because things didn't go well initially in this first conflict. There were a lot of defeats, there were tremendous physical losses. And indeed, think back to that saying, what would happen if you have unlimited conflict? Someone really doing anything and everything they can to win. And that's what we have examples of all over. And you might remember that we explored this and this whole concept of this King of the World, and no, we're not referring to the benign or benevolent King of the World. We're referring to somebody who had done all kinds of crazy and corrupt things and may well have been a physical leader of these forces, the ancient enemy that had returned to the land after the portals were opened. But it's a very interesting account, and it's a wonderful folk tale. And yet there does seem to be a lot of evidence that backs it up, especially if you actually go to Ireland and Ventry Beach. There's also the statement, it's even in the song, on Skellig Michael, where the King of the World rested for a while. And that is a beautiful and incredible old world site if you can ever go to Skellig Michael. And yes, it's a testament to filmmaker Rian Johnson's auteur capabilities as a director that he managed to make that place seem very depressing, because I've been there in person and it's anything but depressing. So if anybody says Rian Johnson is a bad director, I submit that as evidence that he can actually film scenes very well to give a psychological impression. So, anyways, enough of my bad jokes. Oh, Sky Sage, the Riddle of Steel. Yes, very true. And it always comes back, doesn't it? So moving on, we also have the concept of the Balrogs. And really to give you an idea of what kind of physical threat that the Fourth Era civilization was facing. They were completely overwhelmed. Now, we don't really know exactly what level of technology they had. How far along were they? Were there components of their technology that might even appear as magic to us? All of those things are possible. And maybe they did even actually have what we would think of as magic. We don't know for sure. But something else that you see come up a lot, and yet it's not encouraged to show even in science fiction, or in science fiction anime in this case, is the concept of Snake Man, or Snake Men. And you might recall, the Masters of the Universe, there was the original cartoon in the 1980s, they brought it back in the early 2000s, and in the second season, the main adversary were the Snake Men. And for whatever reason, it's just not kosher to actually talk about this as an adversary. Now, you could argue, well, it was because of special effects limitations. They couldn't depict snake men very well in live-action films in the 1980s, 1990s. Well, they actually pulled off a lot of other interesting things using, different illusions and plots and so forth. And if you go back and you watch classic Doctor Who and classic Star Trek, where they had a very limited budget, they actually did some very creative things. So, I don't know. I just don't think you're going to get support if you're actually going to show this, because is it possible they had some sort of creature, some sort of warrior that looked like this? I think there's a high probability of it. Or is it just simply analogy? Because remember, I don't want to give snakes a bad name, because, snakes are just animals out there. There are snakes out there that are animals, but there seems to be some sort of representation that these sort of creatures may well have existed. Because it's not much of an assumption to say that there is an innate human fear when we talk about reptiles such as this. And then when we really think about reptiles. And in fact, going back to classic Star Trek, Captain Kirk himself even said it when he fought the Gorn in the episode Arena. And so perhaps it was all an allusion to that. Ah yes, King Hiss. Quite an interesting adversary, and it's also interesting that the revived He-Man series did not last after this season when they introduced King Hiss as the primary adversary instead of Skeletor. So, just something interesting, and may well have been some sort of active allusion to what did really happen in the past. Again, we don't know for sure. Robert, I deal with snakes in business on a daily basis. Indeed, I think in many ways we do. Dwayne, I'm always looking to see what is beyond what I see and what I know. Ah, yes, I agree completely. There we go, Donald. Snakes are usually symbolic of trickery or deception. And I think that's ultimately what this ancient enemy figured out, was that they had to use trickery or deception. And the real reason that the Fourth Era civilization was victorious, which they were in this First Era conflict, was because trickery and deception was used a little bit more directly, and they were able to counter it. But moving on from this concept, we do have a lot of artwork that does depict and give us an idea of what this struggle may have been, and how much it strained the Fourth Era civilization. Now, whether you're referring to the works of Tolkien or you're referring to any sort of conflict that feels like it's about to be lost, that seems to be as bad as things got for the Fourth Era civilization, or Tartaria as we call it. Many cities were destroyed. They were overwhelmed by this force that was relentless against them. They had no real way to counter it at first. It took time for them to adapt and overcome it. And you think about these tales that we have of the fall of Gondolin and these great battles where they're completely overwhelmed by these creatures, these forces, these immense capabilities that this ancient evil brought to bear against them. And that's where we have all these tales that constantly are repeated, or maybe repeat is not the right word, but are told in different ways, whether you're looking at different cultures, or whether you're even looking at what we might consider works of fiction, such as Robert E. Howard. And you might remember how he referred to certain civilizations which everybody thought he was making up, but oddly enough, when you actually look in the official history, many of them do seem to conform to these civilizations that Robert E. Howard was just making up. He was the author of the Conan stories. So there seems to be a lot more connections than we're initially aware of. And why is that? I'm not really sure. Hey, Sooner West, good to see you. Ah, Rod, yeah, lots of griffins too. No short of griffins. And what they represent. But what kind of technology did the Fourth Era civilization have at that time? You know, we don't know. Was it something we think of as steampunk? Was it far more technologically advanced than anything we think of today? And this is why we have all these science fiction concepts that are still in our mind, because they're not really science fiction. Or was it something more like this, where it was what we think of as classic medieval warfare? You had one static defensive position or one fortification falling after another. And it was really just a terror to the people at the time. What was really going to stop this and these forces? Now, oddly enough, you also have official works of art, if you will, whether you look at tapestries or paintings from what we think of as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, and they show you conflicting accounts as well. They do show you armies fighting each other, but then they also show other strange things that don't always seem to add up. And if you look into other cultures, you'll also find many of the same themes that come up in the very points that we've been talking about. So this isn't just one culture's story. This seems to be a story that's shared throughout many different cultures and many different origin stories. So it's not just something that you can say it's isolated. And how do you explain that? Well, you have to take into account that it means that this happened to all of us, or all of our predecessors in the distant past. We're not so divided today as we are led to believe. Now, I know that's a controversial thing to say. Yes, they do show blemmies, don't they, RB? They do come up a lot, don't they? Yeah, you're close enough there, PMC, but yes, and that's going to be a series of explorations coming in the future of the channel, although I'm trying to find a good way to tackle it, because there's a lot of detail in that. A lot of detail. But there's other images that give you the idea that maybe it was something in between. Maybe this was a period of decline for the Tartarian civilization, and their technology wasn't initially up to resisting these forces that they were facing, which might be why the ancient enemy thought that they could win in a direct conflict initially. And then you also have other sorts of technology that's shown. And then this is one of my personal favorite, yet also tragic depictions of the fall of Gondolin. And it probably gives you an idea of what some of these armies may have looked like that the Fourth Era civilization was facing. You know, things we think of as dragons and endless armies, hordes of creatures that are trying to overrun one of the last great cities at that time. And it does seem to be something that has just as much documentation and just as much detail to it as any official historical battle that we have. Now, of course, you could say, well, Tolkien just made up a lot of things. People just make up things. Yes, people can be creative and they can make up things, but I was always impressed by the amount of detail and thought that seemed to go into it. Now, of course, we look at some of the worst weapons that they have, and, were they dragons? Were they some other creatures of destruction? Were they technological implements of destruction? We can think of them as dragons, but one of the works of Tolkien with the First Age concerned the greatest dragon of all, Calagon, the largest of all dragons. Now, could you think of this as some sort of incredible destructive weapon that the ancient enemy had? No doubt about it. And who knows what it could do, or what it couldn't do. Albie, there were also giants fighting in the mountains in Tolkien's book. Yes, that was actually one of the most interesting things they showed from The Hobbit. That scene was all too brief. It was very interesting. Yes, The Hobbit, the first movie, probably the only one they should have made. Just my humble opinion. I'm not going to dump on Peter Jackson. He did the best he could. He was put in a bad situation. But anyways. And then you also have these accounts of these incredible battles between the leaders. Now, that's more of what we would think of as a direct conflict. Here you have Mechlor fighting one of the great Noldor nobles, at least that's what the artwork is, but could this actually represent something else going on? One of the great leaders fighting one of the great leaders of the Fourth Era civilization. And this is just a representation of it. Absolutely. And then you also have this desperate series of battles to try to enable the civilization to survive. And oddly enough, you can find this in other accounts, even the accounts from the Middle Ages, if you pull back far enough and look at some of the overlapping details, because you have these constant references to plague and death and war. But if you think of this as an ongoing conflict, and then you even see how they try to tell us that some of these other conflicts, such as the 100 Years' War, and you actually have numerous conflicts that they say, well, these are wars that lasted for decades or hundreds of years. And then, well, there were breaks, there were breaks. Of course, there wasn't a break between the English and the French in the 100 Years' War. There was just a bit of a timeout, if you will, during that bubonic plague. It was just a minor inconvenience. Yeah, it's funny how they say conflicting things like that. But if you really take it more at face value and realize that they're talking about this great and terrifying conflict, and who knows how long this conflict lasted? Was this decades, or was this really hundreds of years? And how terrifying would that be to actually be locked in a mortal conflict for that long? And we're not talking about one of our nice little controlled wars today where we're just throwing a few drones at one another and we have all these constraints. You're talking about unrelenting conflict where anyone and everyone is a target. Now, I'm certainly not saying that there's things about today's conflicts that are better or anything like that, merely given the comparison. Just imagine what kind of psychological terror that would afflict on the population. And not to mention what kind of civilization and society you'd have that would really be able to stand under those conditions and continue to fight. Because one of the things we know about our present society is that, our psychological will might not be all that we think it is at times. But I'm sure there's plenty who could debate me on that one. Dwayne, I need to get a cool alter ego name. Kathy, who says that these wars were actually real? Good point, Kathy, and they might not be. They might be something else completely different. Maybe it was really just a time of destruction, and war is just merely a facade to put over it. That's always a good point. Sarah with an H. I always thought dinosaurs and dragons are the same thing, just different language because dinosaurs are fossils of animals that were alive. That's a good point too, and I've had the same thought many times. Rebecca, I wonder if the lands outside the ice wall have legends and stories about us. Maybe they do. And maybe, whether they're outside the ice wall or in a parallel reality or whatever, that could be very, very true. And that's a great thought. And again, something else I've thought myself. And you have this constant great struggle. Now, whether you want to say it was a conflict or there were other means or weapons that were used at that time. And this just gives you a little bit of a concept of the size of Calagon. And modest estimate, 1 kilometer, 0.62 miles, the size of a mountain. And indeed, that's what the text says. So are you talking about some kind of super weapon, or are you actually talking about a literal creature that was this large? How exactly do you counter this if you're fighting this directly? And this is what you'll see in a lot of the artwork when you look at what was really happening. And think about this with the first conflict, that these are the kind of creatures that you're facing. Or at least this is the kind of threat that you're facing. And it's interesting to me because some of this artwork I hadn't seen myself either, looking at how some of these battles may have looked, whether it was the fall of Gondolin or any of these other great battles as part of this conflict, where you're trying to overcome these creatures that have these immense and terrifying capabilities. And Tracy Jones says it, the unseen spiritual battle. Absolutely, Tracy. And that's a great way to look at it. Hey, Wendy, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Hector, lots of craters under the dirt and soil. Seen with LiDAR, star forts and walls all over. Looks like ancient battles or cataclysm. And that's something else I've wondered because, yeah, that's all over the place, Hector. And there's actually certain areas you can go, especially when we talk about those deserts, whether it's the Mojave, that little area that's between Interstate 15 and Death Valley. You can find the terrain looking like it's scarred in that way. And this would be an explanation for it. Robert, could be what Homer's Iliad was about. Very likely. Yes, and not that less than wondrous movie Troy, but it wasn't as bad as some films could be, right? Ah, Sky Sage, the Bloodstone Emperor in Japanese lore. Yes. And oddly enough, making an appearance again, referred to in a certain fictional account that we've looked at recently. Albie, warriors were like a dominant class in the past. They were definitely referred to. Hey, my bailiwick zone. Well, thanks for joining us, and hope things are going well there for you. Hope things get better there quick, too. Carl, I've wondered if all the world's armies are actually on the ready for an unseen enemy they are expecting back. That could be possible as well. That's very true. Now, how exactly do you counter these creatures? Now, what we're told, or what we're informed, is that there is the presence, the symbolism, if you will, of eagles killing snakes. Now, that's just a symbol. And yes, I'm well aware that certain nations actually still have it as their standard, as an eagle killing a snake. And it's not just eagles, you also have bears that are doing it as well. And it comes up quite a bit. So, was this to reference some sort of development of a technological weapon that the Fourth Era civilization had? Or did they find something within themselves that enabled them to do this? I mean, we can certainly debate it. Now, Tolkien says there was actual eagles that were representatives of one of the gods, one of the Valar, that came and helped the forces of what we would think of as humanity, although when he was writing about the First Age, he was talking about elves and dwarves. Everybody was fighting against these dark forces of Morgoth, or Mechlor, one of the corrupted Valar. But if we think of this from the Fourth Era civilization facing the ancient enemy, how did they develop it? Was it just a representation? Is it an analogy? Why do we have signs, symbols, statues of eagles always killing snakes? What's that represent? Ah, yeah, that's a good one. That's a really good one. Anne-Marie Miller, the Bible even says we existed before we were born. Very true. In fact, that's actually shared with many other major religions too. Sun symbol around a head represents a god, and gods are idols. That's interesting. Inferno, the great scavenger bird. Yeah, that's true. You can definitely see it like that. That they hate snakes too, says Kathy. Iris Rainbow, winged snake equals dragon. That is very true. Yeah, Sky Sage, referring to the Mexican flag. Yes, it's prominently featured on the Mexican flag. Sarah with an H, we consciousness have always existed. Yes, we have. And you'll find examples of it, though, in some areas where they still show the eagle destroying the snake. And then you also think about the great battle that's talked about in Tolkien's works when he wrote the Silmarillion. Silmarillion, if I'm saying it properly. I know I've heard it pronounced many different ways, but his original work where he referred to the First Age, where you have the eagles fighting and defeating Calagon, Thorondor, the Lord of the Eagles. Now, is it some sort of weapon that they developed, or was it just the fact that eagles don't like snakes or winged serpents either? They want to be the only winged creatures. Not really sure, but it comes up a lot. And if we take it from whatever this development was from the Fourth Era civilization, this finally enabled them to turn the tide. Now, how much of the Fourth Era civilization was destroyed by this attack or this conflict? We don't know, but if we look at some of the total destruction that we have across the land, and no doubt there are areas that seem to be destroyed for a long time, whether we're talking about the Sahara, any of the deserts, and not just them, but there's also other areas where it seems like it should be teeming with life, and we're even just talking about natural plant life, flora and fauna, and yet these areas seem inexplicably devoid of life. Perhaps that's a remnant of this conflict and how destructive it really was. So who knows how many lives were actually lost, how many cities were destroyed. Now, this is a good one. The eagle is the flag of my country, Mexico. Well, thank you very much. And yes, it is featured prominently on Mexico. And I don't wonder, and I've done an exploration on Mexico City. There definitely seems to be a very particular perception that if you're outside of Mexico, you're supposed to have. And yet if you actually go there, it's quite beautiful. Another one of those interesting little observations that I make. Albie, those battles were epic. Yes, and this is exactly why no one will ever make any movies about battles such as this. Because, well, one, they wouldn't get it right. And two, I'm sure they'd want to put in their own points, if you follow me. So, But that's why we see the concept, though, of the eagle against the serpent. And that seems to represent the turning of the tide. And just imagine overcoming some sort of creature such as this, and Caligon, a creature as large as a mountain, or having unbelievable destructive capability. Now, of course, we're informed that our present civilization possesses tremendous capability for destruction, although what the reality of that is something we can certainly debate. But you look at the whole concept of George versus the dragon. St. George slaying the dragon. And that is a bona fide legend, and there is a lot of what we would think of as medieval or Middle Ages artwork that backs that up. And you have the knight that is actually facing a dragon. And there's a lot of different depictions of this, and this is one of the official forms of artwork, and this is actually what I put on the thumbnail, and I'm going to explain why. Because I believe that in this image, we actually have a lot of things encompassed by what this conflict is really about. You have a lot of slain individuals shown in this work of art. Now, of course, you'll be told it's just all from this one dragon, but is this representative? Is this dragon, I mean, does it really look like a dragon? Almost looks more like a demon creature with leathery wings, and that's maybe what the more apt representation that we have here of this ancient enemy, or whatever creatures they were actually committing to destroy the Fourth Era civilization. The other thing I like about the artwork, though, is you show the concept of chivalry, although chivalry, which is something we'll talk about in a second, tends to get, the mentality of it is not properly conveyed now. A lot of people think, well, it simply refers to the concept of courtly love. No, the original concept of chivalry referred to defending those that could not defend themselves. That was the literal translation. That is what chivalry is all about. So if you think about the defense forces of Tartaria actually able to overcome this threat, that is what it's all about. And when you look at this painting, oddly enough, it does have some more advanced architecture in it. And things that would seem to be beyond what we would expect of the Middle Ages. And certainly not necessarily even reflecting what we would think of as classic Middle Ages architecture. Or maybe, if you're in Florence or Venice, right? But that's why I always appreciated this particular work of art, because I think it shows everything at that turning point of the First Era conflict. And you can find lots of examples of George versus the dragon. And maybe George is a representation of one of the great leaders who was able to rally the defense forces at that time. When you actually had defense forces that concerned themselves with defending the nation, and not simply acting in their own best self-interest to get their own best evaluations. Whoa, did I just say that out loud? Yeah, I guess I did, but yeah. Chassis, the palm trees are interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting work of art, isn't it? Sky Sage, I see Jamie. Oh my goodness. Here's a good one. Why do the tail of these beasts always look curled? The only animal I can think of with similar tails are pigs. That's a good point. maybe it's just because it's a creature we don't encounter. Hector, how do you kill a dragon? Gotta use some creature. Either that or there's a weakness on it. There's an inherent weakness. You know, that's something that's also reflected when you look at things like smog. Jamie Griffin, yeah, the Russian flag too. That's true. Johnny, it looks like Florida. Yeah, although maybe all the land looked like Florida at one point in time. And who even knows what it was really like at that point? Oh, yeah, some of these comments just really crack me up whenever we do break. But you can find that there are a lot of references. There are a lot of examples of artwork. There's even a movie, St. George versus the Dragon. Early 2000s. It wasn't too bad. And it had James Purifoy playing St. George. I think it even had Val Kilmer in it, if memory serves. Wasn't too bad. Very interesting plot. Definitely something you wouldn't see today. But there's an interesting modern example I can think of. They wanted to show some artwork of St. George slaying a dragon at a certain museum. I'm not going to say which one, because if I do, I'll definitely be outing who I am. I'm not going to do that just yet. But the museum wouldn't allow it to happen. And so, for whatever reason, it's another example of certain artwork. Now, I'm not saying all museums have this reluctance to do so. You can find examples of the artwork of George slaying the dragon. But it seems to be another one of those things that they just really don't want you to see. And you can find more modern examples of the artwork that gives the same conclusion. Although this is interesting with this more modern interpretation, if you will, of George versus the dragon. So who's to know, who's to say? You know, did it represent some decisive point in this conflict? I think that it does allude to that. Or at least all the statues that we're about to look at that show of dragons and snakes and creatures being slain. Perhaps they'll represent the same threat. And we talk about the age of chivalry. Yeah, there you go, Victor Black. St. George is a heartbreaker. Ah, yes. Barbara, if this art is history, then it's completely subjective. I'm always for the underdog, but the underdog has a story too. Oh, so true. Very, very true. Sky Sage, warship or warship? Ah, yeah. Fun with English right there. Oh, William, the Order of St. George. Yes, there is still an Order of St. George. And yes, if you're a member of the United States Army, or if you've served in the Armor or Cavalry, you could actually be inducted as a member of the Order of St. George to this day. Adam Baum. Oh, yeah, well, see, I had to dispel those notions of being the guy from Northern Exposure. I am Kairos. How about that Dragon's Lair video game, though? Yeah, that was a pretty good one, wasn't it? Way ahead of its time, too. I forgot about that. Oh, Albie Belt. Yeah, Dennis Quaid and Sean Connery. Dragonheart. That was a pretty good one from the 90s. But this concept of chivalry, you know, did it really mean courtly love, or did it actually mean defending those that can't defend themselves? Well, you know, back in, at least in my humble opinion, when Ridley Scott made wonderful films, and he was a wonderful filmmaker, you know, in the past, Kingdom of Heaven, and King Baldwin talked to Balin and talked about the concept of defending those that can't defend themselves. That used to be what it was all about. Now, there may have been more components to it, but if you really want to look at what it was really alluding to, it was defending the defenseless. And he even says it. Perhaps one day when I can no longer protect myself, you'll come here and protect me. That's what King Baldwin said to Balin. And it's a very interesting series of lines, and it's also a very interesting thought process that we have, because how many times does our current society claim to defend those that can't defend themselves, but then oftentimes because of factors beyond control, they leave people to fend for themselves? I'm not making any specific examples, just talking in generalities here. Now, actually combining the concept of courtly love and defending those that can't defend themselves, I think one of the best examples I saw was in the TV show Robin of Sherwood. And whether it was between the first Robin Hood, portrayed by Michael Pratt, pictured here, with Judy Trott, who portrayed Lady Marian, or Marian of Leaford. And those of you who are familiar with the channel, you know this is my preferred version of Robin Hood, because I like the fact that it really seemed to be set in a mythical time. And it really seemed to be set when magic, and yet there were other forces at work. And I think this showed the best example of both real chivalry, defending people who can't defend themselves. And you might recall that in this version, Marion was actually a member of the outlaw band herself, and she was just as much a warrior as the rest of them. Yet they also had certain concepts that they showed with how they cared about one another. So perhaps that was the idea of courtly love. Whereas if you contrast it with the more modern 2000s Robin Hood, where Robin Hood suddenly didn't kill people anymore, and it's a noble aspiration. But then, oddly enough, his character seemed to be so psychologically unstable that he was, just on the verge of breaking a fingernail and he was going to go off on a killing spree. It was really bizarre. But it's odd to think that these two shows were only 20 years apart, and yet it's like they're from completely different worlds. It's just one of those situations, and it's really, really strange to me. The other issue I had with the new one is I kept expecting Marion to whip out her cell phone and call Robin or Gaia Gisborne. I mean, it was really weird. And then going back to the darker side of Ridley Scott, you may have seen this film, The Last Duel. And this film is a great concept that shows you the antithesis of chivalry. In fact, this is like some sort of modern take in terms of what happened. I always appreciated the fact how... this is Matt Damon, right? Sorry, I just had to go there. How it looked like he had a modern shrapnel scar on his face. I don't exactly know how he got that. But yeah, if you want to see this current movie, this can show you what the antithesis or the opposite of chivalry is. And all the characters in this film are quite odious, in my humble opinion. I don't know, it's kind of like the characters in Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined Battlestar Galactica. Is there really anybody who seems like they have any redeeming qualities? No. Now I know, I'm just talking from my own experience, but it seems to be something that if the previous civilization didn't have, if they couldn't defend those who didn't defend themselves, if they didn't really have a love for themselves and each other, how could they have ever achieved victory to begin with? And if people act like this, then, you're going to end up just like the civilization did in Battlestar Galactica, committing a form of personal destruction of your own civilization. Okay, I won't say anything more about that. But if you ever go and you look at some of these wonderful window decorations and the colored glass, you can actually still find examples of St. George slaying the dragon that still have all those representative elements within it. Oh, Jamie Griffin with the classic there from Paul Verhoeven, Flesh and Blood, right? With good old Rutger Hauer. And Jennifer Jason Leigh. I forgot about that one. That was a very interesting film. Oh, KC933, A Knight's Tale. Yes, the one with Heath Ledger. That was a pretty interesting one, too. A little bit more contemporaneous, but I found it a little bit more charming, but that's just me. Definitely a little bit more charming. What's Vaughn got here? All riches went to the firstborn son, but there were second, third, and fourthborn everywhere living in poverty and green with envy. We see them today. Yeah, I just don't know. I just don't know. Normans built the cathedrals. Yeah, why not? We'll just go with that, because it sounds good. But anyway, we transition from the great struggle to the last component of this, victory and memory. And that's what you see with a lot of these remaining monuments or these colored glasses that we have. This was a very difficult struggle. And again, this is something else you can find referred to in multiple cultures about how difficult this struggle was. And there's no shortage of art, of statues that show, whether it's the lion, the eagle, or even the griffin, slaying the snake. And that's not an image that you can find so much anymore. It used to be a lot more prevalent. And whether you were just looking at some random quote-unquote high school somewhere that was built anywhere from 1880 to 1930 in the United States, you might find a random statue like this, showing a lion slaying a snake. And then, of course, we go back to the great monument to the Battle of the Nations. Now I ask you, is there anything on this that looks like it represents the struggle against Napoleon and France? And now keep in mind, this is a monument built in Germany to commemorate this battle. And yet, according to official history, there were Germans that fought on both sides of that battle. There were Germans officially that were fighting for Napoleon's army. That is a quote-unquote historical fact. Now, of course, people can debate it. But whatever the case may be, are we really to believe that in the early 1900s they threw up this incredible monument? And they were able to build it right from the start looking old? And now, of course, people will tell you, there's a process for this. This is just called rustication. Yeah, rustication. Yet another capability that we don't have, but we apparently had in the 1900s. Or does it make more sense that what we're looking at here really is a monument? It's just a much older monument to a triumph that was achieved in that conflict. What are your thoughts? Please share. Michael Walker, Indiana Jones, only the penitent shall pass. Search for the Holy Grail. Okay, I have to ask, are some of you actually looking at my segue or my upcoming explorations? I really have to ask. Kathy, built in 6 months. Yeah, you're not too far off. A couple years is what they say. Yeah, I'm with Robert here. Old as the dirt. It does look that way. RB, what's underneath it? Good question. Maybe that's another stop we'll have to take the airship to once we finish it up on our way out. Julia, red sandstone? No idea. Limestone, marble, something else? Who's to say, who's to know? Jackie, rust gargantuan construction style. That's a good one, Jackie. I might have to use that one. Rust gargantuan construction style. Wendy, what was on top? It's a good question. It does look like they removed something, doesn't it? Maybe some giant obelisk or something else that we don't know for sure. Yeah, I could see those being pit bulls or lions or what have you, but I mean, who knows? Maybe it's some animal that doesn't even exist anymore. But it's down here at the bottom, you know, you have the snakes. The snakes are there. You have the fallen, if you will. Now you could say, well, those represented the fallen in the Napoleonic conflict. Yeah, everybody was wearing their armor and they had very advanced looking eagles and swords of light, you know, because why would you actually depict people in line infantry regiments fighting with muskets or the early rifles? Well, they really didn't have very good early rifles yet then, but they were starting to. This is the interior. And again, not seeing anything. Now, there are other images, but I dare not show them on this live stream, but you're certainly welcome to explore them. And in fact, you might even find a very particular interesting image of one of these great carvings or statues, or whatever you want to think of them as, that shows a woman, and it looks quite a bit like the same image of the woman on the Soldiers and Sailors monument that we have that represents the state of Iowa in Des Moines. It's really strange. And it's something that doesn't make sense, especially when we consider the very, very unique sensibilities about women being depicted naked during that particular time frame. But I guess they were totally cool with it in Iowa in the 1890s, and they were okay with it in Germany in the very early 1900s. You know, you didn't need the 1920s to have that happen. It's just one of those conflicting accounts. It doesn't make sense with what we're told. But again, you see these interesting shields that they have here, if that's indeed what they are, and then the armor that they're wearing. I mean, again, what's this represent from the Napoleonic conflict? I know I keep bringing it up, but... Ah, Kathy. Yeah, very Knights Templar vibes. I agree. Jackie reminds me of tiki heads. Yeah, you're waiting for one of them to talk. Reminds me of that scene in the movie Labyrinth. WMP, Merlin is missing and wouldn't look out of place there. Yeah, that's true. You can actually film a lot of great films here. Science fiction films, high fantasy films. Yeah, Gregory, good call out there, the floor. William, Iron Cross on the floor? Let's take a look. Hopefully I won't see anything here. I guess. I mean, it doesn't even seem like it's a direct cross. It kind of seems like it's a cross, though, doesn't it? Have to go take a look. It's on the Explore in Person list. Here is the construction photo of it. Yes. See, they could build it looking old already. Yes, another one of our very wondrous construction photos. Because it has scaffolding around it. Now, why in the heck would you put scaffolding around a stone masonry construction? whether it's the magical red or whatever limestone that we have, or whatever the heck it's actually built out of. Of course, you all know that I think it's built of something much differently. And it's probably very similar to those incredible retaining walls that I came across in Dubuque, Iowa, I would suspect. But I don't know. I haven't been there. But again, another one of these images. Oh, I love this. The little advertising here on the scaffolding. Yes, restoration. Would fully agree. No, KC933, you don't need workers, you just need scaffolding. Yeah, exactly, Sarah. Restoration, reconstruction, cleaning seems to be what we're seeing. But it's not just this. This is one of the most prominent examples, in Germany. But you can go to Kansas City. This is Liberty Tower in Kansas City. This is part of the World War I monument. And they threw this doozy up in the 1920s, again from public donations in Kansas City. And tell me, what exactly do these figures have to do with World War I soldiers in the trenches? I mean, what do we have here? We have an individual wearing some kind of crown device that's very unique. Very, very large swords again. I guess we're doing Cloud from Final Fantasy here. And I mean, what's this one over here? These almost look like more advanced helmets. Now, of course, we'll simply be told this is to represent, the great deities that apparently watch over the dead of World War I. And to be fair, you do find things on this monument that might allude to the actual soldiers of World War I, especially on the frontal piece. But these images certainly don't. And oddly enough, there's been a lot of restoration done on this one too. Hector, Sentinels, Guardians of Olympus. Yeah, that makes the most sense to me. Were they representing some high guardians or high guards of the previous civilization? RB, I had a feeling you'd have something good to say about that. Ads on the old architecture. Yeah, well, what can you do? What can you do? Why is the flame on top? That's a good question there, KC933. Julia, Liberty Memorial is in front of the KC Federal Reserve Bank. It has some interesting statues as well. Yes, and you might have noticed that I didn't cover the Federal Reserve Bank when I did the exploration of Kansas City. And I'll just say this, it wasn't for lack of trying. Yes, but, as always, make of it what you will. Kitch, I had a feeling you'd have something to say. Kansas City was the fashion hub when that was built. Oh, very true. And everybody was all about commemorating World War I, it seems. So take up a donation. KC933, there's griffins below it, but their wings are covering their faces. Oh, yes. Yes, yes. Here's a better image of it, so you can see these figures a little bit more clearly. And once again, you still have the same impression that this is a little bit older. I mean, officially, this tower isn't even 100 years old, or it just turned 100 years old. Image was taken a little bit before that. And yet, for whatever reason, we have something that looks very out of place again. Now, I don't know. It's possible, I suppose, but it just seems improbable. And then you also have all the plague columns that we looked at across Europe. And you go across Europe and you'll find these very intriguing plague columns that are built to commemorate the plague, I guess. Why would anybody want to commemorate that? I mean, it's really odd because you look at the details on them and you get the impression of something much more horrifying going on. And yet at the same time, there's some very impressive art, even if it is horrific art, that went into constructing these things. And some of them are a little bit more of your traditional columns. Oh, yeah. Nice little ball back there on that building. But they all seem to have this symbolism, this mix of things together in a pile, which is very intriguing. Plague columns. And you might remember the one we looked at, I don't know, Space Fraggle here. Could be a warning. Yeah, it could well be. Dwayne, I lived in KC for 17 years in my 20s and 30s, never thought twice about these things. Yeah, I'll be honest with you, Dwayne, I went down there several times before I thought twice about it, and I can't tell you how many times I went through Union Station there, before they turned it into a shrine to the Kansas City Chiefs, which is probably what it's always going to be now, so. Okay. I won't say anything more about that. Oh, here you go, Casey. Yeah, I did actually get this. This is from the World War I monument, so this is at the foot of the Liberty Tower. They'll tell us these are sphinxes that are covering their faces, but since when did sphinxes have wings? Well, I guess they can have whatever they tell us they have them. Or are they actually griffins? I'm definitely with KC on this one. I think they do represent griffins. But yeah, you can actually walk your way up from Union Station, and you might recall during the on-site exploration, I opted to do that during the hottest day of the year last year. It was a lot of fun, but it was worth it. And really verify the strength of these materials. And you get the feeling that this is a structure that's going to last. And no, it was prominently destroyed by 2 hydrogen bombs in the film The Day After. They actually showed Jason Robards walking among the wreckage. But I have a feeling that even if you did have those kind of forces, not that I'm saying one way or the other, that this structure would endure it. Just my opinion. I could be wrong. Here's another close-up of those figures from the Monument to the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig. And again, you have this giant face here. And another one of these intriguing plague columns. And I mean, what is this really showing? I mean, it's really odd to me that anybody would build a column to commemorate a plague. I mean, is it to memorialize the dead? Is it to respect those that survived? Is it both? It's just really strange. And you do see them in places in Europe. And, is it just another explanation for the column or what? Not really sure what to make of it. And that looks similar to the big statue behind the Pope in the one hall at the Vatican. Oh yeah, you don't say. Yeah, that is a rather strange one. Yes, the Papal Hall Auditorium. The building that just happens to look like a snake, inside and out. But I'm sure that's coincidence. It's coincidence, Anne. It's coincidence. Ah, Jackie celebrates violence. That is probably one of the best interpretations I've seen. Yeah, there's a lot of odd things in that building, Anne, including the fact that there's no crosses to be seen inside of it, but, yeah. So could this have been a monument that the ancient enemy put up or decided to construct to commemorate all the violence from the second conflict? Maybe. It's just interesting, especially when you compare and contrast it with all these statues that we have of the lion or the eagle killing the snake. And then you also have some medieval artwork that gives you some other impressions, that maybe there were certain knights that were subverted or corrupted, in a manner of speaking. And they even poke fun of that in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, of all places. Because you have what seems to be the Knights Templar here. Now, if it's a black cross, you'd say it's the Teutonic Knight. That seems to be favored by some sort of spiritual force or some sort of ethereal force. Different ways to look at it, of course. And yet we also have the conflicting account that the Knights Templars and the Teutonic Knights were likely corrupted. And maybe they were. Maybe there was one point in time when they represented the legitimate defense forces of the earlier civilization, and they were corrupted. And that's the legacy they still carry to this day. Explorations to come in the future. Now this is a really interesting one. I'm trying to remember where exactly this plague column was, but this is at the base of it. And you have this terrifying violent act committed here, and I'm not really sure what this has to do with the plague. But then you have this individual looking to this other individual that seems to be influencing this. It's just really strange. Yet there's also a lot of detail. And keep in mind that this is actually in the stone itself. Now, I'd have to go explore in person to see if this is of the same material or if this is a new addition. Somehow I get the feeling it's a new addition, but I could be wrong. Not really sure. Yeah, I don't know, or something we might think of, or what they would tell us has that capability. Don't really know. Queen Peachy Keen, is that an owl on his head? Let me look. Might it be? I don't think so. Just really strange though, and I think it goes back to commemorating that act of violence, someone falling under negative influence to commit violence. I mean, I think it's really that simple. But it contrasts with these other images, and you should be aware that these images of these snakes being defeated are a lot older than we might like to believe. And they're also reflected on coins. Of course, they're coins that don't have dates on them. So I guess it doesn't prove anything, does it? We need numbers to prove things, right? But it does provide clues. Now, this is really intriguing because you almost get the impression, and one of the issues that they have with the Liberty Tower, the World War I monument in Kansas City, is that it tends to get vandalized now and then. So was this an act of vandalism? I mean, here you can actually see some of the different coloration on this. And it really gives you the impression of this being a lot older. Going back to Leipzig. But again, not really sure what to make of it. I mean, this right here definitely refers to a lion. But, I mean, look at how advanced some of this looks. Yeah, I definitely feel something about this that, reaches you emotionally if you see that this has been desecrated in some way. But it seems like it's something we do now. We're all about desecrating monuments for whatever reason. Yeah, I agree. A.B. Jones, it does almost look burned, doesn't it? Vaughn, the octagon. Yes, there are wings. Like it's some kind of platform that you could ride on. Pendragon. Does that really look like Napoleon? I don't know. Well, it's definitely not the Napoleon that was shown in the most recent film, because this individual looks focused and not disinterested. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely something to go explore in person. No doubt about it. And then another one of these plague columns. And a lot of these show up over Central Europe, interestingly enough. Kind of reminds me of a certain symbol in the Warhammer 40k series. I'm not going to say which one, but those of you who are familiar with it, you know. And then, oddly enough, we'll talk about this, the kind of interesting change that we've had where the griffins were converted into lion-looking creatures. And you actually see that in a lot of statues, too. But since when the heck did lions ever have wings? Oh, and apparently this one has a halo, too, or he just happens to be posing in front of the sun. And again, this is official medieval art, so what the heck is this supposed to represent, officially? Yeah, PMC's right, chaos. And I think that's the reference to the conflict that you have. Ah, Jamie, the Chimera. And was the Chimera good? Was it with the forces of civilization? Was it with the ancient enemy? We don't know. Sean, yeah, that's what they tell us. Who the heck knows for sure? Maybe Napoleon is just a 3-flavored ice cream and that's it. Alchemy created beast. Yeah, that seems like it would be the most likely. Jackie, unicorns everywhere with their horns knocked off too. Yeah, I agree. You do see a lot of that as well. Hey, Sooner West, thanks for that, and welcome to the new members, and by all means, check out the member content. Appreciate that. Yeah, Reality Checkmate, definitely a biotech of some sort. And I think that's what the legacy really is. And so who knows what these plague columns are referring to. Definitely not monuments from the first conflict, but probably something following it. And yes, since you're probably asking, we will get around to exploring the second conflict. The one that didn't end so well. We've done some direct explorations on it, but I think as a little bit more time passes and we get more details, we should look into it. There's also the prominence of lions, and you still see lions in a lot of positions where they're in these sentry position, as though they're guarding the structure, and clearly representations of what the previous conflict had ended with. And if you pay attention, and speaking of unicorns, you will find unicorns that are still shown on the inscriptions such as this. And then, oddly enough, showing other strange details that don't seem to make a lot of sense. And of course, why not have a lion? So yes, very interesting here. We have a unicorn. We have a woman here who almost seems to be a divine being holding up some kind of spherical device. Very, very interesting. And then we have a lion. And so what would that represent officially from our civilization? Not really sure. It's just like when you have all those warrior women that you see in the state capitals from the 1800s. How exactly does that make sense? Can't really explain it. They were all about the Tartakians. They were building statues because they knew Tarna was going to be a great warrior. You know, they saw heavy metal early. Yeah, right. But that, you know, it's amazing some of the cheetah flips you get when people try to explain these discrepancies you have. Because what you tend to see is a society where everyone participated. Everyone had the same roles and responsibilities. And there wasn't this big deal made about who could do what and who couldn't do that. You could either defend yourself or you couldn't, and you defended those who couldn't defend themselves. The original concept of chivalry. Ah, yes, and what one of these great armories may have looked like. Now, one of the things we're going to explore coming up here in the near future is the sudden advent of this actual modern technology that we have with large-scale guns or cannons. Because isn't it interesting how, with naval ships, how we suddenly went from small ships to much larger ships? And does that refer to other technology that was rediscovered? Unless, of course, we're going to accept that cannons were what we told they were. Are hydras real? Yeah, there's probably something like them, or was something like them. Rebecca, we totally live in a video game. Yeah, it feels like that, doesn't it? Oh yes, Adam, we will be looking at sound weapons. And not just the ones from the original David Lynch Dune either. And this whole concept of the eagle or the lion defeating the snake, it's a lot older than you might like to believe. Indeed, on some of these statues, this one purported to have been from the Sumer civilization. Yes, you heard that correctly. Sumerians. Apparently, they had statues of lions killing snakes. Isn't that intriguing? So, a couple thousand years ago, and hey, yeah, lions killed snakes, and, we're going to make a statue of it. I mean, official history, if you take it at face value, has you asking a lot more questions. But if you can get to Europe, or if you're from Europe, I strongly advise you to take a look at these plague columns, as they call them, and see what kind of meaning you can derive from them. Because they do seem to be some kind of old world architecture, but how much have they been subverted, changed, or repurposed? Well, that's what on-site exploration is for. And I think that's why they're interesting. But then you can look at something like this that really actually seems to memorialize the unfortunate victims, and this is looking back at the monument to the Battle of the Nations. And yet you have the powerful horse depicted here that's well armored. And so this actually does give you an idea of the monument that was to all the fallen of that conflict. And it looks like they didn't hold back on depicting how horrifying a lot of these people died. And keep in mind that this was to commemorate the fallen of the Napoleonic Wars. And this was well before trench warfare was invented, or even when they tried it out in the American Civil War, which I always found an interesting proposition. But it really gives you an idea of what kind of horrifying ways a lot of these people fell. This doesn't look like they fell to a musket ball or a bayonet or a cavalry saber. No, it looks like they died from something much worse. So, were they plague victims from the Napoleonic War? I mean, there's really no way to actually justify anything that they have on this monument. I know I've reinforced that point ad nauseum, but it's just really strange to me. William, I've worked as a cement mason for years, and I don't know a single stone mason that could do that. And when I actually talk to the legitimate people who are stonemasons, that's exactly what they say as well. And thank you for that, Space Fraggle. And we got 5 more new members. Scott Baker, 1/3 of the fallen angels built everything? Yeah, it might come down to that. Yeah, I mean, it's really it, Barbara. And I know some people try to say that alternative historians look to make things a little bit more palatable, but that's really not the case. I think in some ways, and that's one of the points I wanted to make, the real history, we have to be prepared, may be a lot worse than what we've been told of recent history. And that's why I showed that saying up front, because I certainly don't want to say that I'm just trying to make things more optimistic. I mean, I believe that the previous civilization did achieve greater heights, but they also had a much greater fall. And that's the darker side of the tale, if you will. But there are certain areas that you can go to, whether you're in the United Kingdom or well across the United States, and you'll still see these much older statues that do show the lion defeating the serpent. Now, if you actually go on site and try to put these in videos, for whatever reason, few of these statues survive, but apparently they used to be a lot more numerous, and so I can't imagine why. That they were really commemorating this great victory in the first conflict. But what are your thoughts overall about the first conflict in this exploration? The Alien Races book. You would love the Cabbage Patch Kid orphan trains if you heard of them. I've never, ever heard of that. And I've never, ever done a video on the orphan trains, have I? Just a couple. I'm being sarcastic. Milk Tea Alliance. It was the battle of the Middle Ages of Middle-earth. Yeah, that's probably a more apt way to describe it. Stabulator. Biblically, Jesus can come at you like a lion or a lamb. It's been a while since I've heard that saying, but yes, I remember hearing that a lot more in the past. Jamie, it did occur. Too many calling cards set in stone. And I think that's probably the most literal way to say it, too. I am Kairos. The statues must represent reality. And I think that's something that constantly is being obfuscated every day. And that's one of the reasons why I say you're one of the best on-site explorers, because you have those little witticisms and yet those facts that you actually back up with observations. So, oh, thanks, Robert. I appreciate that. Julia, St. Christopher was a dog man who was delivered of his animalistic nature. Ah, yes. I might have to do an exploration on all the accounts of the saints. That might be interesting. Atom Bomb, the lion defeating serpent equals good overcoming evil. Very true. And whatever that good may be. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to complete our last exploration on Tartaria as a whole. In the past, we've looked at the greater glories of Tartaria. We've explored what it may have looked like, and these are just theories because the reality is we have no idea exactly what it looked like. But we have a good idea of what it may have looked like based on the remaining architectural examples that we have that endured to our own civilization in the 5th era. And yet, for whatever reason, the civilization of the 4th era, what we call Tartaria on this channel, is a civilization that we find very alluring. We also find that many of the greatest achievements in humanity and its history seem to be reflected in Tartaria, and the actual intention behind this civilization, which was to achieve balance within the individual, but also to achieve balance between the individual, the cities, and nature. It's certainly something that we can see in our current civilization, that we tend not to have balance. At least not a balance that we can recognize. We oftentimes see ourselves being moved to polar opposites on any and every issue, whether it's the differences in our ideology or our appearances or even our economic systems. And as a result of our deference to this type of conflict, we see our civilization in ruins. We see the ruins of the previous civilization of Tartaria. We know that it was a great civilization that had achieved wondrous heights, a unity of purpose within humanity. But how exactly did it fall? In the past, we posited who was truly responsible, and we came to a little bit of a conclusion that perhaps we were responsible, or at least our progenitors were responsible. Yet, looking deeper into the history of Tartaria, I think we can still see the very forces and their effects in our current civilization that caused the fall of the previous civilization. If you think about what every civilization aspires to be and do, it's to grow and to increase in size and knowledge. And while the people of Tartaria looked within themselves, they sought more lands to explore. There are accounts in myths that they opened portals to other lands, that they attempted to access areas that they didn't have access to. In effect, they had reached the physical boundaries of their realm or their lands, and they sought to explore others. It was in this exploration, though, that they opened a portal to a dark land, and they allowed some other dark beings to reach their land through this portal. By the time that they had realized what they had opened up, they found themselves facing an entity with a power that they couldn't even begin to imagine. An entity that seemed to reflect some sort of anti-deity, or an anti-god, if you will. This anti-god quickly filled the land and turned the people of Tartaria against themselves. But how was this achieved? What happened that caused the great civilization that was unified in purpose, that had achieved balance, to completely fall apart and ultimately be destroyed? We can still see the remnants of Tartaria everywhere we look across the lands. Castles, ruins, some buildings that are kept in better shape than others, and even older remnants of the buildings of previous eras. When we look at our 5 eras theory, we start with our contemporary era because that's where we are now. And we examine all of the aspects of our contemporary era. People will tell you that some things don't apply to Tartaria and some things do, but the reality is everything does. Because we are descended. We are the progeny of the civilizations that came before us. It doesn't matter if there were 4 resets, 5 resets, or 2,000 resets. We are still the same people. It's safe to say that there have been vast changes within both ourselves and our civilization and the society. When we look at the 4th era, the Tartarian civilization, we examine their great triumph. But now we're going to look at the decline and fall. How did this great civilization erode and disintegrate, ultimately turn upon itself, and then found itself isolated and destroyed by the forces that it had exposed itself to in its attempts to explore new lands, to access other lands? And we can see the great tragedy of the destruction of the once great examples of architecture. And we can see the remnants of it, even perhaps in some of the images that we have that perhaps were not altered from the 19th century. The height of the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization, is something that we believe dreams are composed of. It's very difficult to properly imagine or visualize exactly what these images were in this civilization. The finest examples of architecture and society working together, people achieving balance, looking inward for internal strength, and most importantly, possessing self-discipline. What we know as our paradigm in our current civilization is that we have external discipline. In other words, external institutions, individuals enforce discipline upon us. We do not seek to be self-disciplined. We tend to be discouraged from seeking self-discipline. And what this leads to is when you rely on another force, authority, or individual to impose discipline upon you, it means that that entity is ultimately dictating how you're going to live your life. They're going to tell you what's important, and they're going to do it in the most insidious ways possible. Even though you may be consciously aware of it, even though you may see it, and you write about it and you lament about it every day of your life, you're oftentimes willing to accept it because you've been conditioned to accept it. You've been conditioned that there can be nothing better in the past, or that in the past everything just fell apart because the previous civilization was corrupt. And indeed, a lot of what we're allowed to or encouraged to explore when it comes to a previous civilization was the ways in which it was corrupt. Because you'll see that the corruption is reflected in our current civilization, and even in our supposed recorded mainstream account, you will find the examples of corruption. Yet contrast that with what we see as the dream of Tartaria, or the 4th era civilization. And that dream is a people who had self-discipline, who had self-restraint, and yet at the same time achieved balance. They were able to overcome their physical differences and all the other differences and live in a state of balance. Now, of course, this has to be mocked, this has to be derided, because this is a threat to the current power structure that we have in our 5th era civilization. No one is supposed to know that they have greater capabilities as an individual, that they have spiritual strength which cannot be matched in any way, shape, or form. Yet looking at the examples that we have of the 4th civilization, with the great achievements in architecture, we'll be told that somebody else had to do this. It was a divine being, or it was some form of artificial intelligence, which nowadays seems to be a substitute for a divine being for many. And if that's what you choose to believe, then so be it. But we have to remember that many of the greatest works of art that depict the wonders of the past came from a human being. It came from a human's creative inspiration. The tales of fantasy did not come from some artificial intelligence. They came from human creativity, the spirituality within every single human being that no doubt comes from some sort of divine power. And while I may not have spoken of it directly in the past in the channel, I've certainly alluded to it. And the reality is, our search for understanding and who we are comes from within. It does not come without. And ultimately, that was the great mistake. That was the mistake that was made in the past that led to the eventual destruction and downfall of Tartaria. When you look at all the myths and all the examples of what may have been in the past, even that does not match the grandeur for what was in reality. Because we can look across the lands and we can see great examples of horrific destruction in Siberia, in the northeastern portion of Siberia. And we'll have a designated historical account that'll tell us what was there, and will tell us about the great kingdoms that were there. But I don't believe that at the height of its civilization that a person, a citizen of Tartaria, the civilization, or whatever it was actually called, because remember that we just use that name as a placeholder because we don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what exactly they called their civilization or how they divided their lands, and perhaps they didn't divide their lands at all. They didn't believe in such a concept. It's always interesting when you look at the concepts of certain cultures that we're told believed in boundaries on land, but then conversely we're told that they did not believe in the boundaries of land, that land had now boundaries, that land was for everyone. Now you might be arguing, well, how could anybody live in such a system where there's no division? Well, somehow we manage to live in cities now where there's no actual division, although we believe there's a division of ownership. Is it real, or is it just what we accept? These are all questions that we have to explore. We also look at the concept of Camelot and King Arthur and the legend of Excalibur. I believe that that particular myth alludes to what was very likely the last legitimate regime of Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours. It was not based upon one person's vanity, or one person acting as king. Yes, there was King Arthur, but King Arthur didn't see himself as some sort of divine monarch. What he ultimately saw himself as was a person who worked for the betterment of the entire civilization. That was indeed the very crux of the idea of the Round Table. That everyone was equal, no one was above any other, and that the role of being the leader was simply a function. It was not some sort of near divine being that was to be worshipped. Ultimately, Arthur sacrificed himself for what was and the dream of what could be. And it's those very words that we have to remember. Things were once very great in the past, and they could be very great in the future. The way things were subverted was by kings and titles. Once the entity that managed to infiltrate Tartarian civilization, or the Fourth Era civilization, grabbed hold, one of the first things it seemed to do was to subvert individuals. And where that started was many individuals taking the title of king. How much do we value the title of king? How much do you see the use of king this and king that? King Charles, King Henry, King Charles the Simple, King Charlemagne. It goes on and on. Although Charlemagne had himself declared emperor, it doesn't really matter because what you have is this obsession almost with titles. Now, before anybody says that I'm degrading anybody who puts value in titles, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that when you embrace the importance of titles, you have to be cautious because before you know it, you are suddenly putting the certification of a larger group on your own self-value. In other words, the titles that endure to this day. I remember there was a political science teacher during his class who was explaining to his students that we don't use titles in the United States anymore. For example, you would call me Lord Schmidt if we still use titles. And then one of the students quite accurately quipped, yes, but we still have to call you Dr. Schmidt. Everybody got a good chuckle out of that, including myself. But what it says, though, is that if you value titles over your own individual value, then you're letting someone else dictate what your value is. And that is not what life is about. We dictate our own value. And no matter how many people try to tell you fallacies, how many people try to convince you that they're doing the right thing, or whoever dresses up in kingly robes with their wonderful adornments and decorations, there really is no difference between one human being or another. And one of the other things that caused the Fourth Era civilization to fall apart was not just the embracing of titles and indulgence in self-vanity. It was also the change in identity. What we saw was suddenly a more increased political division, a geographical division within the lands, dividing up the lands into many different principalities, and suddenly changing the ways in which they were facilitated, and even embracing the concept of being governed. If you have a people who are self-disciplined, what need is there for governance? But if you have a people who are not self-disciplined and have to be disciplined by an external force, then you have every great need for governance, which involves individuals taking the titles of king and dressing up in all the pageantry that you can imagine, with flowing robes and very nice tights. And we have room for queens too, or it doesn't really matter. Anybody can call themselves a king. It doesn't matter what your gender or your background is, or it's interesting how it even transcends cultures, that pretty much anybody can be declared a king for any point in time, or an emperor. And indeed, many of the symbols of this endure to this day. So what you have that's been effectively undermined, and what was no doubt effectively undermined in the Fourth Era civilization, was the concept of leadership. Instead of a leader seeing themselves as a servant of the people, they looked to themselves as divine beings. The defense forces of Tartaria were subverted as well. Now, I've long had an exploration looking into the military orders that we have of the medieval period, and not just focused on Europe, but all the other military orders across the lands. Yet, we can see a great example in the military orders that we believe are associated with Europe, even though they operated extensively in what is today the Middle East, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights Hospitaller, all the other military orders that we have. The one that tends to get the most attention, though, is the Knights Templar. What we're told about the Knights Templar in our official history is that they were a military order that was founded for the Crusades, for the European or the Latin nations, as they were called at that time, to recapture the Holy Land for Christendom. And in their foundation, though, we seem to have views of chastity, views of poverty, and that they were specifically dedicated to their mission. But the Knights Templar, unfortunately, according to the official account, decided to embrace the concept of wealth, and that they were, in effect, one of the early banking systems, at least according to the official history, that presided over Europe, and as a result of which they were targeted and destroyed by the monarch of France, again according to the official history. And yet, if we look at how they operated, the Knights Templar, if they had stayed true to their original vows, what was closer? What was closer to the original concept of the once great military that defended Tartaria or the Fourth Era civilization? I believe it was the original vows and concepts of chivalry. And I've noticed that when you study this, when you study the official historical account of medieval history, you'll be told that knights only applied chivalry to noble ladies and nobility. They didn't apply it to anybody else. But what if it did apply to everyone? What if the reality was the concept of chivalry, the concept of humility, of actually embracing and defending others, did universally apply to everyone? How much does that change these military orders in our eyes, if that's what they were truly about? And over time they became subverted. Much in the same way that the leaders of Tartaria were subverted, these knights became subverted and suddenly began to embrace the importance of material possessions, and not just money, but even the idea of money. Strangely enough, the very same things that we contend with every day. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of material possessions in and of themselves are bad. Like everything else, it's how we deal with things. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by anything, whether it's material possessions, love, or anything, it can cause us to do things that we would not do otherwise. Because suddenly we start to value the idea of this over our own self-discipline. We lose our self-identity. And if you look at the things that we contend with every day, it seems as though everything is directed towards keeping us from understanding our true selves. And this is very true when we look at the official historical account of the Knights Templar. This is a military order that had a very noble purpose and seemed to have a very noble method, a methodology behind how they lived true to that noble purpose and those values. Indeed, the Knights Templars are viciously derided as evil, or the antagonists, in the novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. You might remember we looked at the Scott Monument when we did our exploration in Scotland. It's a very striking monument that supposedly depicts characters. This is the original depiction of the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding 1 horse, and the reason being because they were impoverished. That was one of their essential vows. Very similar to the Franciscan monastic order in Christianity, that they embraced poverty. And yet there is a conflicting account that says that these Knights Templar devolved into concepts of violence, and they believed in violence and engaging in acts of violence, and that became more important to them, in addition to their valuing the idea of money above all else. And you can find a similar account with the Teutonic Knights, who supposedly took in the remnants of the Knights Templar and then continued their so-called colonization efforts into what is today Prussia. It's very interesting, and this is all the official historical account. Yet, again, there are conflicting accounts that say that these military orders once had a more noble purpose, that knights truly did live true to the concept of chivalry, and that it didn't just apply to a select few in the population, but it applied equally to everyone. So what's reality and what's merely the blended fiction? It's hard to say. And that's all by design. We're not supposed to have a clear account of the civilization that preceded us. Indeed, you're encouraged, and it's quite okay to talk about the Knights Templar once they had devolved. There's an interesting episode of Robin of Sherwood, yes, that show again, that I think tells the entire story of the Knights Templar in one single episode. It's called 7 Poor Knights from Acre. And in that story, Robin Hood and his band of outlaws come across a group of Knights Templar, 7 knights, who had a small object, a gold object that was a depiction of the order of the Knights Templar stolen from them by this individual. As a result of this, the Knights Templar seek to find the individual responsible, kill him, and then reacquire their material item that supposedly means everything to their honor. And in the process of doing so, they kill many innocent people trying to retrieve this object, and they even kill a member of Robin's band. And Robin himself has to actually engage in hand-to-hand combat, single combat with one of the knights to try to save one of the other members of his band. It's a very well-written story, and it's very interesting how within an hour they managed to summarize the exact progress of the Knights Templar. How they went from being a monastic order that was dedicated to the defense of a society to an order that was self-serving. Supposedly it was about their honor, but the reality is it was about the material item that had monetary value. That's why they went on this little quest near Nottingham, and why they killed innocent people, and why they attempted to terrorize Robin Hood and the outlaws. They even ran afoul of the sheriff and Guy of Gisborne, although the sheriff, acting on his own opportunistic notions, tells Guy to stand down and allow the Knights Templar to hunt Robin and the band of outlaws. Because why do it when they could have someone else do it for them? In the end, Robin Hood prevails, and I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. The knights are stripped of the armor, and then they're sent off on 1 horse. And you can see that the 2 knights here, without their armor, do actually reflect what's supposed to be the ideal concept for the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding on 1 horse. I'd missed that when I initially viewed the episode, but upon rewatch for this exploration, I saw the truth in that. And that's what it reflects. It doesn't just reflect that truth for military orders, leaders, or monastic orders. Consider that Tartaria was carved into successor states, ruled by kings. And these are the aspects of Tartaria we're supposed to talk about. And you'll find 3 greater Tartaries or Tartarias all over the map in many different locations. We also have the accounts of madness that gripped the previous civilization. And there's no doubt that there were some people who tried to live true to the values of self-discipline, and they ran afoul of the compromised leaders and military orders, some of which who still acted in accordance with the rules of the old civilization, and others that didn't. And this is likely why we have these accounts of all these strange sicknesses, such as the dancing plague and many other bizarre accounts from our supposed incorruptible mainstream historical account. But I do think there's a lot of truth to this. There is a lot of truth into the history that we are able to see. But what seems to be the consistent reality is that we're only supposed to see the previous civilization as being a failure. We're supposed to question ourselves, and we're supposed to feel helpless, and the last thing we're ever supposed to develop is a sense of self-discipline, a sense of the ability of exploring ourselves and finding our own spiritual strength from within. You need to rely on other institutions. You need to have other people tell you what to do. When you look at how the lands were carved up and divided politically, you notice that as maps become newer, these political boundaries become more prevalent. They're a lot easier to see. Why is that? Why is it on older maps it seems as though there are no true political boundaries? Why do these accounts of mass insanity and hysteria seem to increase in certain times? What makes more sense? Was there really just all these isolated incidences of mass panic going on? Or was it really a population that was trying to struggle to find itself, to understand why their entire civilization was collapsing, why the leaders that they had trusted had suddenly turned against them, and were constantly keeping them turned against one another? Why was the great defense force that they had once relied on suddenly turning to materialism and not living true to the values that they always had? It had to be a very frightening experience for them, and no doubt many did try to find their way back to their own self-internal images, and yet at the same time, they found the people that they had relied on turning against them. And it's safe to say that this mentality, this primary method of operation, continues to this day. It is very easy to keep people turned against one another, and you can find any variety of reasons to turn people against one another. And I have no doubt that even in the grand heritage of the previous civilization, that some groups were told that they were more responsible for the achievements than other groups. It's another way. It's more of a positive way that you can turn people against one another. You can say that some people are more responsible for others for achievements than others. You can then say that those people who are not more responsible are the outcasts from society. They're people who shouldn't be listened to. You can use any number of means to reinforce this. You can use financial incentives, you can use patronage, and you'll see it every day. And no doubt this has been with us longer than we can begin to imagine. That is how the previous civilization ultimately collapsed. How it broke down into successor states, corrupted by the very forces of evil, corrupted from the inside and the outside, disintegrating and eroding, until finally it became vulnerable. Vulnerable by the very forces that it had unfortunately encountered. In its exploration for more land to explore, they had unleashed a great evil. An evil that destroyed them from the inside. And there's no doubt that there are concepts of this evil that remain with us to this day. And you don't have to look very far or very hard to see examples of it. Can it be overcome? Well, the reality is, it's still unchanged from when King Arthur said it. Defend what was and the dream of what could be. There is still a very powerful dream of what could be. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Ruins across the landscape that give us clues that there was a once great civilization that encompassed the entire world. The civilization that we refer to as Tartaria. The civilization that preceded ours. And while we may not know its actual name, or what language they spoke, we know that this civilization existed, found in the wondrous ruins that dot the landscape. Indeed, many still in use today by our current civilization. But how did this wondrous civilization fall? What was the final chapter in its true history? Today we are going to explore that when we look at the final conflict of Tartaria. The Legacy of Gog-Magog, Tartaria's final conflict. In the Five Eras theory, we posit that there were several civilizations that preceded our own. There may have been 4, there may have been 5. These civilizations were destroyed by what we consider hard resets, and then the civilization had to begin again. Were these natural disasters, or were these artificially induced disasters that destroyed these civilizations? In the 4th era Tartarian civilization, we see that it had 3 phases: a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline and a fall. During its ascendancy, we believe that it won a great conflict against some unknown external enemy. We've posited at the locations and origins of this potential enemy. Yet in this exploration, we're going to consider the final conflict that Tartaria faced, which brought about the downfall of this wondrous civilization, the civilization that managed to build incredible structures all across the land, cities that were built on top of the ruins of previous civilizations that we call the Foundation Eras. The 5 Eras theory explains the fact that we do have deep structures with many foundations and many structures that are built on top of the remnants of previous structures. But there may have been many more eras. Indeed, the many memorials that we see across the land. Were these really memorials to national achievements, as we're told, great conflicts that we know of in our official history? Or are the other symbols that we see that don't make sense to us representative of something else? A great victory that Tartaria won in its first conflict during its civilization. Perhaps that explains why we see all these discrepancies with what we would think of as Civil War monuments or other great conflicts that we're told of in our history. Memorials that were simply repurposed and redesigned to reflect the achievement of Tartaria. And yet, Tartaria faced an adversary that it could not possibly overcome. The legacy of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog, it has a biblical reference to it, although, oddly enough, it appears in multiple religions, mythology, or official history, or scriptures, or whatever you want to call them. Gog-Magog represents an evil force, originally referring to 2 individuals, and yet in many of the maps of the Mappamundi and the history of the Middle Ages, we're told that Gog-Magog represented an entire force of individuals. Perhaps it was this sort of external threat that faced Tartaria that they were unable to contend with. Or maybe it refers to the fact that many individuals within their own defense forces, this civilization's great leaders, who were corrupted or subverted by the external forces that had somehow been unleashed on their civilization. Or perhaps it was merely the same adversary that Tartaria's predecessors had faced, and now they had returned to exact their revenge on the people of Tartaria. Initially, their first conflict was unsuccessful. The unified peoples of Tartaria were unable to be overcome. Therefore, this invasion force, this external threat, had to change their tactics. And we have accounts of Gog-Magog being people who were completely and totally uncivilized, and perhaps not even human beings in many ways, shapes, or forms. We even have accounts that they were individuals who were cannibals and did not recognize the precepts of society. Whatever the reality is, we have many maps from the Middle Ages that indicate that the invaders of Gog-Magog were confined to a particular geographical area. And indeed, the residents and the denizens of Tartaria were threatened, as it seems as though these ruthless attackers were unrelenting in their efforts to completely destroy the people. But we just don't know if this was simply an external threat or if this was something that attacked Tartaria from 2 sides, externally and internally, as we do have accounts of individuals who were corrupted by the influences of Gog-Magog. There's also the account of Alexander the Great, the hero, at least the hero when it comes to contending with the threat of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog, the nation with uncivilized individuals that was destroying all the other civilized peoples of the world at that time. And maybe Alexander the Great represents Belisarius and Lucius Aurelian, leaders who we're told have a place in history, but may in fact have been the final leaders of the great Tartarian civilization, trying to defend it from the unrelenting attacks from the threat of Gog-Magog. Many of the maps that we have from the Middle Ages, or the Mappamundi, indicate that the threat of Gog-Magog was confined to a geographical area. They were trapped by walls and natural terrain features that were reinforced by obstacles. There are many different biblical references from both Christianity and Islam that indicate the actions of Alexander the Great and the threat faced by Gog-Magog. Very odd for something that only came from one particular area of the land, that it's referenced by multiple civilizations and multiple religions in our current civilization, giving the indication that perhaps there's a lot more to these origin stories and this threat of Gog-Magog than simple mythology or simple fantasy. When we look at many of the images in the accounts, we see various efforts by the people led by Alexander, the remnants of the Tartarian civilization, to attempt to safeguard their civilization by building walls and building forts and building outposts that would survive this attack. What we don't know is if this attack from Gog-Magog came before or after what we consider the Great Reset event. There might have been a series of disasters that befell Tartaria, and they turned to their final great commanders to try to defend and safeguard their civilization. We know that their efforts failed over time, and yet we still have the remnants of their fortifications. We're told of great walls built across the land, and indeed the Gates of Alexander, which exists to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, may have been an attempt to try to forestall this attack, this invasion by these forces of Gog-Magog, this nation that had no civilized rules, that seemed to be unrelenting in its efforts to destroy the people of Tartaria. And when we look at the maps that we have, we can even find the natural passes through the mountains of the Caucasus. We're told that the Gates of Alexander fall right here, where there's reinforcing fortifications on the natural mountain passes. Although for all we know, perhaps the original mountains themselves may not be quite as natural as we're led to believe. When we study more of the maps of the advances of the individuals of Gog-Magog, or this terrifying nation, or whatever this external threat truly was, we can see that the walls were not successful in keeping them contained. That eventually, according to subsequent maps, they spread across the entire land, destroying every civilization that came in their way. And indeed, we do have historical accounts that try to relate this to other nations that we're told were simple hordes that crossed the land. It wasn't just the Mongols, it was also the many other forces of the Huns and the barbarian invasions. Perhaps all these refer to the same force, the original force of Gog-Magog, simply being hidden at different points in our history, with different individuals all referring to the same event. Perhaps the great leader Alexander the Great, whatever his name really was also corrupted by this influence. We have accounts and images that show Alexander the Great even working with the devil, or at least the forces of evil, to try to contain these forces of Gog-Magog. Perhaps he fell to the corruption and the influence that had overcome many of the leaders of Tartaria, and this led to the unfortunate fall and total destruction of their civilization. After they were hit by the natural disaster, or perhaps it was an artificially induced disaster, they were left at the mercy of these relentless forces of Gog-Magog. This would explain these isolated monasteries that we have, and what we view as reset compounds. Perhaps they were also survival compounds, the last-ditch attempt by a civilization that could see its end rapidly coming, trying to preserve anything and everything that they could of their civilization, their society, their true history, all that they had learned, even their architectural capabilities. And yet we know that very little of the previous civilization managed to reach ours. Indeed, to even question its existence is oftentimes ridiculed. But we can look at these subsequent maps and we can see that the remaining people of the world were the ones who were waiting for their final destruction, that the efforts of Alexander or whoever the commanders were had failed, that Gog-Magog had succeeded in utterly destroying the Fourth Era civilization, or at least completing its destruction. Where do all these origin stories derive from? If we consider the Olympic opening ceremony at the Olympics in Sochi in 2014 in Russia, perhaps we have a depiction of the actual account of the fall of this civilization that preceded ours, that we call Tartaria on our channel. Now, why would we have clues that are mixed into Olympics opening ceremonies? Perhaps it's the same reason why we have so much subtext that comes into our films. There are individuals who may be aware, or at least have some sort of awareness of what transpired in the past, and therefore they attempt to integrate it, whether it's in the plot of certain films or even in a depiction in the opening ceremony of the Olympics. At Sochi, we see many interesting things of the rise of a civilization. Of course, our current mainstream will tell us that this is merely the depiction of the rise of Russia, and that this is supposed to be a Russian patriotic ceremony. And indeed, it may well be. But yet, when we look into the subtext and a lot of the symbolism of this particular ceremony, we see something that seems to allude to far more than just the rise of a single nation. Of course, we recall the fact that our current civilization seems to operate on the basic principle of division. Geographical division, division of the people, division of economic and social class. Was it always that way? It's hard to say, but when you actually go and you observe this opening ceremony from Sochi, you can see that there are many different aspects of humanity that seem to be depicted. Not something that's pertinent to one particular group of people, but perhaps something that depicts the story of us all. The unfortunate events that occurred with the last reset, where the civilization known as Tartaria was completely destroyed. Not a civilization that was confined to one particular set of lands or even one single continent, but one that encompassed the entire land, the world, all of its peoples. And when you look at some of the events that were depicted in the opening ceremony of Sochi, you can get the idea that they're really telling the entire story of humanity. It's from these depictions and these displays that we have an indication of what may have happened to the Fourth Era civilization. We have a force that seems to have come through some sort of strange portal. How exactly did this happen, we don't know the details on. But we even consider the actual Olympic ceremony with the lighting of the 5 Olympic rings, and we're told that the 5th ring didn't properly light, and it was merely a technical difficulty that bedeviled the ceremony. However, it's a very appropriate choice of words because we consider that 5th ring looks like a portal. And indeed, we did see that portal depicted in another part of the ceremony. We saw a representation that could have been the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria, represented by a city here, threatened by a force that initially they were able to overcome. The Fourth Era civilization winning their initial victory when they were confronted by whatever the malevolent force truly was. And we consider that to have happened during the ascendancy period, or the very height of Tartaria's capabilities, when they managed to achieve their greatest architectural achievements, and they had a unified civilization. We have other depictions within the ceremony that show this force coming through a portal and threatening the civilization. Now, of course, this could all just simply be interpretation by what was merely intended to be a beautiful nationalist ceremony. But yet, we're always told that's the explanation, and we have many other strange depictions at many other Olympics, not just the Olympics that occurred in Russia. So it appears as though there's much more that's actually being conveyed that may be hidden in the subtext or the details behind these elaborate opening ceremonies. We can find many representations that might reflect the greater and grander nature of humanity, a nature which we are oftentimes told to ignore or doesn't truly exist. I suggest that you watch the entire opening ceremony at Sochi and the other Olympics, and watch the opening of the Olympic ceremony at London in 2012 and many others. You'll see strange depictions. You'll see some things that do seem like they're representing the athletes and the competition that's about to occur in the manner of world unity, at least that's what we're told the Olympics represents. But when you look deeper into it, you will find a different message. You will see that they seem to be conveying something else that happened in the distant past, without actually saying it. And perhaps the Olympic opening ceremony at Sochi is most notable for what it depicted, with the aspect of a portal, a civilization initially being triumphant, and then eventually being overcome by a malevolent force. A malevolent force that managed to change its tactics and overcome what was a unified and powerful civilization, also a people who were strong internally. There's other strange aspects to the ceremony where you see the way that things are depicted and illuminated and how exactly they show a different nature of humanity. Oftentimes this is something that we do get in these Olympic ceremonies, and as mentioned before, it's not just in the opening ceremonies. It can oftentimes be found in many of the plot details of many films. Even some of the greatest science fiction films have many allusions to the old world or the previous civilization. So if this is where we derive what actually happened, then how did Tartaria's decline really come about? Clearly there were vulnerabilities within the civilization that came about that enabled this malevolent force to overcome it. And this is what led to the final conflict and the downfall of the civilization. We consider the fact that in the Five Eras theory, we have 3 civilizations that preceded Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. Now, were these civilizations that preceded Tartaria as unified, or were there other details behind them? We really don't know, and we don't really even have clues. We only have scattered legends and myths. What sort of ascendancy did they reach? How far did they come in their architectural capabilities? Or, more importantly, how far did they come in their capabilities of the individual? We have many myths and accounts, whether it's in religious texts or other means, that indicate that human beings in the distant past actually lived much longer. We're told that these are merely legends, and yet when we look around we can see the remnants of a great civilization that had much greater capability than we can imagine. We can think on the earlier eras. Perhaps before Tartaria in the Fourth Era, there was star fort builders in the Third Era, a people who managed a tremendous architectural and geometrically precise, focused civilization. Perhaps it was much more ordered than we can imagine. And it's not to say that any one of these civilizations were completely utopian. Indeed, they all must have had their own vulnerabilities and own issues, and that's why they continue to fall. And perhaps that's what we are unfortunately forced to live, is a cycle. The cyclic repetition of the rise and fall of civilizations. Or perhaps there is a way that we can move beyond it. Perhaps there's a way we can preserve all that which we learn and not have to go through this cycle. We look at what our current civilization is, the Fifth Era as we call it. A civilization that has the hallmarks of a pseudo-civilization in many ways. In the fact that it seems to represent many of the values that we had in the past, and yet there's something about them that just don't feel as though they're completely genuine. As though we're told of wonders and greatness that we can ascend to, and yet all the time we're constantly given reasons why we just can't reach it. Why we don't have the ability to take care of all of our own people, or why we're constantly at conflict with one another. And perhaps the reasons they give us are true. Perhaps there are legitimate reasons for why we have so much division and so much conflict. Or could it be that what we experience every day is simply the remnants of what came before, or the modern and current incarnation of it? The continued division of civilizations and human beings is exactly the vulnerabilities that existed in the previous civilizations that led to their downfall. Yes, one would say there may be a lot of speculation, but I don't believe there's as much speculation as we're led to believe, because of the fact that all of these accounts exist in all of our religious texts in every major society that we have across our current civilization today. So it would appear that there are accounts of that civilization reaching its ascendancy, having abilities that we can only begin to imagine to this day. How far did they really go, though, in the last civilization? Did they actually have the ability to draw power in many different ways? Did they have the ability to generate power from the air, from crystals? Did they have all their power needs met? And as a result, they managed to achieve a balanced society. In other words, a balance between an individual contributing to society and then a society that genuinely contributes to the welfare of an individual. Perhaps it's all just a dream, something that cannot actually be achieved. Or maybe that's just what we're supposed to think. Whatever the reality, the undenied achievements of the past have to be considered, because those ruins still exist to this day. And indeed, many of those things that we call ruins, the state capitals, the opera houses, all the wondrous structures that we consider palaces, and then we consider the remnants of the star forts that we have to this day, many of which are in wondrous shape despite all that they've been through, with time, reset, and then even if we accept the mainstream's account of history, consider all the other factors of weathering and the conflicts that they've been through. And yet these structures stand to this day, many in very pristine condition, and many being used currently as government buildings or commercial buildings or any other number of uses. Also consider the infrastructure and logistical capability of the civilizations that came before us. Great airships that had unlimited capability to move vast objects and much great amount of materials across vast distances in a rapid amount of time. Clearly they had some method of energy generation or fuel consumption that was vastly superior to anything we know today. For all we know, perhaps what we use today is the surviving remnants, the derivatives of what came before. Of course, the oftentimes theme that we're given is that we are supposedly at our technological ascendancy at this point now. But is that really true? Or is the reality that we've simply declined from having much more advanced technological capability in the past? Many of the clues that we have and a lot of the evidence that we can see indicate that the civilizations that came before us actually had a greater technological capacity. We cannot replicate the buildings that were constructed in the past. We supposedly can build taller buildings, although we don't know if that's true. And supposedly we can build structures that are much more effective than the structures in the past in terms of housing larger numbers of people and caring for the needs of many people. And yet we can't build or reconstruct many of the state capitals that we have in the United States. You don't see anyone building the great opera houses or palaces that are across Europe or whatever current designation we give these wondrous structures or edifices across the land. Yet we also consider the destruction and descent of the civilization that preceded ours. They had much greater capability, and yet they still fell. And why exactly did that happen? We've explored that on the channel, and we consider the reset event that occurred, whether it was a natural or artificially induced disaster. Was it plasma fire from the sky? Was it some sort of cymatic force that induced a mud flood and completely destroyed the soil? Was it a vast tsunami or flood? Or was it all three of these events, which eventually eroded and destroyed the civilization's capability to exist and defend itself, leaving it in a state of vulnerability? We don't know the exact details, but we have many different clues. We also consider the fact that there were no doubt survivors from these horrific events and even from the second conflict, the final conflict that Tartaria faced that led to its final destruction, the attack of what we consider Gog-Magog. Was that really any of its names, or are these just the names that we assign to these events that we only have a recorded myth of, something that we can't officially understand? There's nothing that's actually recorded in epic detail of what truly happened. So all we have are these vague memories, these myths, these accounts that become blurred over time, that become confused. And then, as we establish a new history with constant historical revision, which we know happens, we realize that these events become even more confused. Perhaps Aurelian and the other leaders that were represented at that time were other leaders of Tartaria who fell to the corruption, or perhaps they died trying to defend their civilization. Consider the final destruction of Tartaria, with the last siege of the remaining cities. We have many different accounts of sieges of cities and their destruction, and these are very terrifying accounts of the last remnants of people trying to fight for survival. They must have known for years or decades or perhaps even longer that their destruction was imminent, and they faced a very horrifying reality. They knew that there were many efforts that were undertaken to try to save their civilization and to try to save their cities. And yet, despite their very best efforts, they were unable to defend themselves from this malevolent force that had been terrorizing them for such a long time. And suddenly they found themselves unable to defend themselves. We even have some images that indicate that there may have been cities such as Bologna that had some other means of defense. We're told that the great towers of Bologna were a means of both offense and defense, but that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, unless perhaps those towers had some other capability. We also consider the works of what we're told is high fantasy from J.R.R. Tolkien, such as the Fall of Gondolin, or indeed the complete destruction of all the elven kingdoms at the end of the First Age, as he calls it. Perhaps this is synonymous, and is indeed an exact account of what happened with not just the civilization that preceded ours, but indeed the civilizations that came before them. There's a lot of myth and a lot of folklore from many different peoples across the land. And yes, we do have accounts of a more biblical sense or a more religious sense of direct evil, of devils, demons, and other creatures. And indeed, there may be details behind that may be true. And for all we know, maybe it is an exact account. We just don't know. And what to make of the so-called heroes or the leaders that tried to preserve the civilization? Were they real? Were they corrupted? Or do we just have a very vague memory of them? We have no shortage of these terrifying apocalyptic images that show the unrelenting destruction of many of these great cities. And we're told that this is merely a time during the Middle Ages when people were driven by fear and superstition. Yet they were also capable of building large cathedrals and tremendous architectural achievements that stand with us to this day. This is why we have so many difficulties with the mainstream account. Why do we have fortifications that are in very remote places in the land? Unless there genuinely was some sort of effort undertaken in the past to try to enable a civilization to survive, an unrelenting threat that had forces beyond our wildest dreams that were constantly attacking and destroying it. And it seems as though these forces of Gog Magog, or whatever this malevolent entity really was, only grew stronger as they increased the amount of land and lives that they destroyed each and every year in their total and complete destruction of the Fourth Era civilization. The people facing terror, trying to survive, trying to find a place where they could hide or where they'd be safe. Perhaps there was even an attempt to parlay one final negotiation to try to enable some portion of the civilization known as Tartaria to survive. And while there may have been an honest attempt at a parlay or a negotiation, it was simply a ruse. Simply a final ruse to bring down the last defenses of Tartaria, to leave them vulnerable for the attacking forces, which were then unleashed with their full potential, to destroy the remaining cities and to destroy the people of Tartaria, of the Fourth Era civilization that preceded ours, once and for all. And indeed, as we can attest to, everything was destroyed. Their society, their history. The only thing that remained were some of the structures, and indeed the foundation structures, perhaps remnants of the buildings that preceded them. What a terrifying time it must have been to realize that survival was not guaranteed, to realize that people would be without hope and without dreams, and their only hope was to try to live to see the next day. Oftentimes we're told that this is the lowest state of existence for human beings, and there's no doubt about it that in the previous civilizations they did face this many times. We're told in our current mainstream history that other peoples have faced this, and indeed they do to this very day. But I think it's important that we all remember that all of us in some way are connected to these survivors who underwent these trials and tribulations. That as long as there were survivors from this calamity, this downfall of civilization, there will always be hope for the future